Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've debated for months about whether I should share this. My family thinks I'm obsessed, and maybe I am. I've gone down dozens of internet rabbit holes since it happened, searching for answers that never come. This August changed everything I thought I knew about the world around us. For context, I'm not some conspiracy theorist or someone who sees things that aren't there. I'm a 42-year-old construction manager who spent my entire adult life dealing with concrete facts and measurable realities. I'm skeptical by nature. My wife Emma jokes that I don't believe anything unless I can touch it with my own hands. That's what makes this so hard to process. It was August 14th, 2023. We were driving back from my in-laws' place in Missouri, taking the scenic route through the Ozarks instead of the interstate. Emma was asleep in the passenger seat, and our kids, Lily, 12, and Jake, 9, were in the back watching movies on their tablets with headphones. It was probably around 9:45 p.m., and we were on State Route 16, that winding road that cuts through the Ozark National Forest in Arkansas. If you've never driven through there, it's beautiful during the day, but completely different at night. There are stretches where you don't see another house or car for miles. No streetlights, no gas stations, just dense forest pressing in from both sides, and more stars than you can imagine. The GPS had us on this route, and I figured it'd be more interesting than the highway, even if it added an extra 40 minutes to our trip. We'd passed through a small town about 30 minutes earlier, and I hadn't seen another car for at least 15 minutes when I noticed headlights appear in my rearview mirror. The road was curvy, so they would appear and disappear as we both navigated the bends. I remember thinking it was nice to have another person out there, even if they were a couple of curves behind us. I was driving carefully, maybe around 30 miles per hour. The road was narrow, and there were occasional patches of fog hanging in the low areas. The moon was nearly full that night, which helped with visibility, but I still had my high beams on. We rounded this bend, and that's when I saw it. At first, my brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing in a way that fit into my understanding of the world. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but it wasn't. Maybe it was some guy in hunting gear, but it wasn't that either. This thing was standing just off the shoulder of the road, partially obscured by the shadow of a large oak tree, but clearly illuminated enough by my headlights that I could make out details I still wish I couldn't. It was tall, easily 6 feet, probably closer to 7, but it wasn't the height that was unsettling, it was the mass. This thing was broad, with shoulders that seemed almost twice as wide as a normal person's. Its body was covered in what looked like thick, matted fur or hair, but the color was what really threw me. In my headlights, it had this strange grayish-green tint, almost like weathered bark or moss-covered stone. Not brown, like a bear or any other animal I've ever seen in the wild. I immediately slowed down even more. My first thought, honestly, was that someone was playing a prank, some local kids with a costume trying to scare drivers on the remote road. But as we got closer, I realized nobody could fake the way this thing moved. It was walking parallel to the road in the same direction we were driving. Its gait was wrong. It moved with these exaggerated arm swings, almost ape-like, but more fluid. Its arms hung outward from its body rather than straight down, and it walked with a slight hunch. Each step looked deliberate, like it was placing its feet carefully, but there was also this unsettling efficiency to its movement. It didn't look clumsy or awkward. It looked perfectly adapted to moving through the forest. I'm not sure if I made a noise or gasped, but Jake pulled off his headphones and asked, "Dad, what's wrong?" I couldn't answer him. My mouth had gone completely dry. I just kept staring as we drove slowly past this thing, which was now only about 20 feet from our car. The weirdest part was that it didn't react to us at all. My headlights were shining right on it, my engine was making noise, but it didn't turn to look at us or change its pace or direction. It just kept walking steadily along the roadside, as if we weren't even there. That's what makes me certain it wasn't someone in a costume trying to scare people. Why go through all that trouble and then ignore the people you're trying to scare? As we passed it, I got a better view of its profile. Its head didn't have a distinct neck. It just seemed to slope directly into those massive shoulders. I couldn't make out facial features from the angle and distance, but I could see that the head was somewhat pointed at the top, not round like a human head. The car behind us had caught up by this point, and I could see in my rearview mirror that they'd slowed down too. Their high beams illuminated the creature from behind as we passed it. I remember making eye contact with the driver in my mirror, a middle-aged guy who looked every bit as confused and alarmed as I felt. He slowed, almost to a stop, as the thing crossed his path. By then, Emma had woken up. "Why are we going so slow?" she mumbled, still half asleep. I couldn't find the words right away. "Did you see that?" I finally managed to say. "See what?" She was looking around now, instantly alert from the tension in my voice. "That thing, by the side of the road, that person, or I don't know what it was." She looked behind us, but we'd rounded another curve, and both the creature and the other car were out of view now. "I didn't see anything," she said. "What did it look like?" How do you describe something that doesn't make any logical sense? I tried anyway, giving her the details as best I could, while my heart hammered in my chest. She looked concerned, but I could tell she thought I was exaggerating, or that my eyes had played tricks on me in the dark. Lily had taken off her headphones by this point too. "Was it a Bigfoot, Dad?" she asked, half joking, half serious. The word landed like a stone in my stomach. I'd never given much thought to Bigfoot or Sasquatch stories before. They were just campfire tales, tourist traps, and TV shows where they never actually find anything. But in that moment, the label seemed to fit better than anything else my mind could supply. "I don't know what it was," I said honestly, "but it wasn't a person, and it wasn't a bear." We drove in silence for a few minutes. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see the thing following us, but the road behind remained empty. Even the other car had disappeared. "Should we call someone?" Emma asked. "The police or park rangers?" I considered it. What would I say? That I saw something walking in the woods that looked weird? That it had grayish-green fur and walked funny? They'd think I was drunk or hallucinating. And what if they did take it seriously and went out looking? What if they found nothing, which they almost certainly would? I'd just waste their time and make myself look like a fool. "I don't think so," I said finally. "I don't know what they could do." But I did speed up. I wanted to get out of those woods as quickly as possible. The kids had gone quiet in the back, sensing the tension. Jake asked if he could take off his seatbelt to grab something from his backpack on the floor, and I snapped at him to stay buckled, much more sharply than I meant to. For the next hour, as we continued our drive, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. I kept replaying it in my mind, trying to find some normal explanation. Maybe it was just a very tall person wearing some kind of ghillie suit for hunting. But why would a hunter be active at night, walking casually along a road? And why that strange coloration and gait? None of it added up. Around midnight, we finally reached the main highway, and I felt some of the tension leave my body as we rejoined civilization. Seeing other cars, streetlights, and gas stations made the encounter feel more distant, less threatening. By the time we got home at around 1 in the morning, I was exhausted but still wired with adrenaline. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that figure in my mind, the way it moved, the impossible breadth of its shoulders. I got up around 3 a.m. and went to our home office, where I opened my laptop and started searching. Bigfoot sightings, Arkansas, strange creatures, Ozark Mountains, unexplained encounters, State Route 16. Most of what I found was the usual stuff. Blurry photos that could be anything, second-hand stories with few details, obvious hoaxes. But then I found a forum where people shared their own encounters, and some of the descriptions matched what I'd seen with unsettling accuracy. The unusual coloration, the indifference to human presence, the fluid yet somehow wrong way of moving. These were details that didn't appear in the popular Bigfoot myths I was familiar with, yet multiple people had reported them independently. People who, like me, seemed reluctant to even use the term Bigfoot because it carried so many ridiculous associations. When Emma found me still at the computer at 6:30 a.m., she was worried. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked. "I can't stop thinking about it," I admitted. She put her hand on my shoulder. "Derek, it was dark. You were tired from driving all day. Your mind probably just transformed something ordinary into something strange." I wanted to believe her. It would have been easier, but I knew what I saw, and the driver of that other car saw it too. I just wished I had some way to contact him, to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. Over breakfast, I tried to act normal for the kids' sake, but when Emma took them to the store later that morning, I was back at the computer. This time, I started looking into the scientific possibilities. Could there be an undiscovered species living in the Ozarks? The rational part of me said absolutely not. These are mountains that people hike through, hunt in, and study extensively. How could something that large remain hidden? But then I read about new species being discovered every year, even large mammals occasionally being found in remote areas. I read about the ecological conditions of the Ozarks, the vast stretches of wilderness, the cave systems. It wasn't quite as impossible as I initially thought, though still highly unlikely. When I finally did sleep that afternoon, I dreamed about being back on that road. Only in the dream, the creature turned to look at me as we passed. Its face was both animal and not. Intelligent eyes set deep under a heavy brow, a mouth that wasn't quite right. I woke up in a cold sweat. In the days that followed, I tried to put the experience behind me. I went back to work, focused on my family, kept busy, but I couldn't shake it. I'd find myself zoning out in meetings, thinking about what I saw. I'd be playing catch with Jake in the backyard and suddenly remember the way that thing's arms hung at its sides. It was like having a splinter in my mind that I couldn't remove. 2 weeks after the encounter, I decided to drive back to that stretch of road. I told Emma I needed to clear my head with a day trip alone, which wasn't entirely a lie. I left early on a Saturday morning and made the 3-hour drive back to State Route 16. It looked completely different in the daylight, less menacing, more mundane. Just a winding mountain road cutting through beautiful forest. I tried to find the exact spot where we'd seen the creature, but one bend in the road looked much like another. I pulled over several times to examine the roadside, looking for, I don't even know what. Footprints, fur, some kind of evidence that what I saw was real. I found nothing, of course. But being there in that place, I felt a certainty settle over me. I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a person, it wasn't a known animal. Maybe it was what people call Bigfoot, or maybe it's something science hasn't classified yet. But it was real. On the drive home, I stopped at a small diner in one of the last towns before the forest gives way to more populated areas. I got to talking with the waitress, a woman in her 60s who'd lived in the area her whole life. After some small talk about the weather and the food, I carefully brought up the subject. "I was driving through the forest at night a couple weeks ago," I said, trying to sound casual. "Thought I saw something strange on the roadside, kind of large, walking on 2 legs, but didn't look human." She gave me a long look, then glanced around to make sure no other customers were nearby. "Route 16?" she asked quietly. I nodded, feeling a chill run through me. "You're not the first," she said. "My cousin's boy saw something similar back in May. about 10 miles deeper into the forest. Said it was greenish-gray and moved like nothing he'd ever seen before. He was hunting out of season, so he never reported it. She shrugged. Most folks around here who've been in those woods long enough have stories they don't tell outside the family. I wanted to ask more questions, but other customers had come in, and she had to attend to them. I left her a big tip and my phone number on a napkin with a note asking her to call if she heard any other stories, but she never did. It's been 3 months now since that night in the Ozarks. I've gone back to my normal life, more or less, but I check that online forum nearly every day, looking for new reports. I've started reading books about cryptozoology and unexplained phenomena, things I would have scoffed at before. Emma worries about me, says I've become obsessed, and maybe she's right. But I know what I saw on that road. Something that shouldn't exist according to conventional understanding walked past my car that night. It was real. It was there. And it makes me wonder what else might be out there in the dark parts of the world, in the spaces between what we know and what we don't. I still drive at night sometimes, taking the long way home, scanning the tree line along remote roads, not out of fear, but hope. Hope that I might catch another glimpse and confirm that I'm not crazy, that what I saw was real, that there are still mysteries in this world that can't be explained away by rational thought alone. Because once you've seen something that shouldn't exist, you can never unsee it, and you can never stop looking for it again. Story 2. I never thought I'd be writing something like this anywhere. I've always been the skeptical type, the guy who rolls his eyes when people start talking about strange creatures or conspiracy theories. But what happened 23 years ago changed everything for me. And even now, I still get chills thinking about it. It was May 27th, 2000. I remember the date clearly because my buddy Jim and I had been planning this fishing trip for months. We both worked construction, and this was our first real break all spring. We'd packed all our gear earlier that day, loaded up my old Ford F-150, and hit the road around 6 in the evening, planning to reach our campsite near Nantahala National Forest in western North Carolina by nightfall. But things didn't go as planned. Jim's wife called with some emergency about their kid getting sick at a birthday party, so we got delayed by a few hours while he helped sort that out. We didn't get back on the road until nearly 11 at night. I remember being frustrated, but trying not to show it. "We'll just set up camp in the dark," I kept saying, even though I knew it would be a pain in the ass. The drive to Nantahala is beautiful during the day, but Highway 74 at night is a completely different story. It's a winding mountain road with sharp turns and steep drop-offs in places. By the time we hit the more remote stretches, it was already past midnight. The radio kept cutting in and out as we climbed higher into the mountains, so eventually I just turned it off. "Man, it's dark out here," Jim said, staring out the passenger window. He wasn't wrong. There was barely any moonlight that night, just a thin crescent that did almost nothing to illuminate the dense forest surrounding us. The only real light came from my truck's high beams cutting through the darkness ahead, and the occasional reflector on the guardrails. It was about 1 in the morning when it happened. We were doing about 40 miles per hour, which was pretty reasonable given the road conditions. I remember checking my speedometer just moments before because there was a sharp bend coming up, and I wanted to make sure I wasn't going too fast. We had just reached the crest of this mountain pass, where the road briefly straightens before descending again. My high beams swept across the pavement ahead as we came around that bend, and suddenly there they were, 2 figures standing upright in the middle of the road, maybe 50 yards ahead. At first, my brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing in the most logical way possible. Hikers, maybe. But within a split second, I knew that wasn't right. These things were tall, easily 7 feet, maybe more. They were standing on 2 legs, but looked nothing like humans. Their bodies were covered in what looked like short, dark hair or fur. The proportions were all wrong. Their arms hung much lower than a person's would, almost to their knees. The entire shape of them was just off. I slammed on the brakes instinctively, the tires squealing against the asphalt. Jim lurched forward against his seatbelt and shouted something, I don't even remember what. The truck skidded slightly, but we were still moving toward these things at a good clip. The creatures' heads snapped toward us, and that's when I saw their eyes catch in my headlights. They reflected back with this intense yellow-green glow, like when you shine a flashlight at a deer at night, but brighter, more intelligent. For maybe 2 seconds, they just stared directly at us, and I swear I could feel them looking right through me. Their faces were flat with these small noses, nothing like a human face, but definitely not a bear or any other animal I recognized. Then, in perfect unison, they both dove headfirst off the right side of the road into the underbrush. It wasn't like a person running away. It was this weird, fluid diving motion, almost graceful, but completely unnatural. 1 second they were there, the next they were gone, the brush at the roadside shaking violently where they disappeared. The truck came to a full stop about where they'd been standing. Jim and I sat there in complete silence for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds or so. My knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel, and I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow. "What the fuck was that?" Jim finally whispered, turning to look at me with wide eyes. I couldn't answer him. My mouth was dry, and my mind was racing, trying to categorize what we'd just seen. Not bears, they were standing too tall and too straight. Not moose or elk, the shape was all wrong. Not humans in costumes, the movement was too fluid, too quick, too inhuman. Should we get out and look?" Jim asked, but there was zero conviction in his voice. I could tell he was just saying what he thought brave people might say in this situation. "Are you out of your fucking mind?" I snapped, my voice coming back to me in a rush. "No way, no fucking way." I hit the gas and sped up, probably faster than was safe on that road. My hands were shaking on the wheel, and I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those things running after us, though logically I knew they couldn't possibly keep pace with the truck. For the next few miles, neither of us said anything. The only sound was the engine and the occasional creak of the suspension as we hit rough patches in the road. I kept the high beams on, scanning the forest edge constantly, paranoid that we'd see more of them. "Tom," Jim finally said, breaking the silence, "those weren't bears?" "No," I agreed. "They weren't. They looked like, you know." I knew exactly what he meant, but I didn't want to say it. Growing up in the Southeast, you hear all kinds of stories about Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but I'd always written them off as hillbilly nonsense. I was a practical guy. I believed in what I could see and touch and understand. But what I'd just seen fit every description of Sasquatch I'd ever heard: the height, the hair, the way they moved. Maybe they were just some kind of, I don't know, escaped monkeys or something, I said, fully aware of how stupid that sounded, even as the words left my mouth. Jim just gave me a look. In the middle of the Nantahala forest, 2 7-foot monkeys? Come on, man. We drove for another hour at least, way past our intended campsite. Neither of us wanted to stop anymore, not in the dark, not in the forest. Eventually, we found this small motel just off the highway in a tiny town I don't even remember the name of. The place looked sketchy as hell, but it had a vacancy sign lit up, and at that point, I would have slept in a dumpster if it meant not being out in those woods. The night clerk looked half asleep when we walked in around 2:30 in the morning. I paid for a room with cash, $70 for a double that smelled like cigarettes and had water stains on the ceiling. But it had locks on the doors and was surrounded by streetlights, and that's all we cared about. Inside that room, Jim and I finally talked about what we'd seen. We sat on those cheap motel beds, drinking warm beers from the 6-pack we'd brought for the fishing trip, and tried to make sense of it. "Did you see their eyes?" Jim asked. "The way they reflected in the headlights?" I nodded. "Like animals, but different." And the way they moved, it was like they just poured themselves off the road. No human moves like that. We stayed up until dawn, talking in circles, alternating between trying to rationalize what we'd seen and admitting to ourselves that there wasn't a rational explanation. The beer didn't help much. If anything, it just made the memory more vivid, like it was happening all over again each time I described what I'd seen. When morning came, we were exhausted, but decided to go ahead with our fishing plans. It seems crazy now, but we'd driven all that way, and in the daylight with other people around, our fear from the night before seemed almost silly. We didn't go to our original spot, though. We found a popular fishing area where there were at least a dozen other anglers spread along the riverbank. Safety in numbers, I guess. The fishing was terrible. Neither of us could concentrate. Every noise from the surrounding forest made us jump, and we kept our backs to the water, facing the trees. I don't think we caught a single fish worth keeping. By noon, we'd had enough and decided to head back home. On the drive back, we passed the spot where we'd seen them. It looked so ordinary in the daylight, just another stretch of mountain highway with dense forest on both sides. Jim got out and walked to where they'd disappeared into the brush. I stayed in the truck, engine running, ready to get the hell out of there if necessary. "There's something here," he called, and my heart nearly stopped. I reluctantly got out and joined him. He was pointing to an area where the underbrush was crushed down, forming a sort of tunnel into the forest. It was wider than what a deer would make, and it went straight into the thickest part of the woods, down a steep embankment. Standing there, looking at that path, I felt exposed and vulnerable. The forest suddenly seemed darker, deeper than it should have in broad daylight. "Let's go," I said, grabbing Jim's arm. "I don't want to be here anymore." We got back in the truck and didn't stop again until we were 100 miles away, back in familiar territory with cell service and gas stations and other normal, everyday things that made the world feel sane again. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I could see those glowing eyes in the dark corners of my bedroom. I researched everything I could find about Sasquatch sightings in North Carolina. There were more than I expected, a lot of them describing exactly what we'd seen: the height, the unusual proportions, the eye shine in the dark. I never reported our encounter to anyone official. What would be the point? They'd either think we were crazy or attention-seeking liars. And honestly, I didn't want to talk about it with strangers. Still don't, really. Jim and I lost touch a few years later when he moved to Florida for work. The last time we talked, he brought it up, asked if I still thought about that night. I lied and said I hardly remembered it. But the truth is, I think about it all the time. 23 years have passed since that night on Highway 74. I've never gone back to Nantahala National Forest, and I never will. Sometimes I almost convince myself that it was just fatigue, that we were tired from driving and our minds played tricks on us. But then I remember those eyes looking directly at me, intelligent, aware, and I know what I saw was real. I still go fishing, but never at night, and never in remote areas. I stick to well-populated lakes and rivers, places where the only things watching from the woods are squirrels and the occasional deer. I don't tell this story often because I know how it sounds, but I know what I saw that night wasn't human, and it wasn't any known animal either. Those creatures exist out there, moving through the forests when most of us are asleep, living lives parallel to our own that we only glimpse by accident or chance. Sometimes I wonder if they think about us too, the humans in their noisy vehicles who occasionally pass through their territory. Do they tell stories about us? Do they warn their young to stay away from the roads where the strange, hairless creatures travel in metal boxes? I'll never know the answers to these questions, and honestly, I'm okay with that. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some territories better left unexplored. All I know is that the world is stranger and more mysterious than most of us want to admit, and sometimes The legends we dismiss as campfire stories turn out to be warnings we should have heeded. So if you're ever driving through Nantahala late at night, keep your high beams on and don't stop if you see something strange in the road ahead. Just keep driving. Trust me on this one. Story 3. It was January 6th, 2022. I'll never forget that date. I was driving my pickup on Route 32 near Blackwater Falls State Park in Tucker County, West Virginia. I was hauling a small trailer with some construction equipment I'd borrowed from my buddy Jim for a home renovation project. The weather was absolutely miserable, the kind of heavy rain that makes you question why you even left the house in the first place. The windshield wipers were going full blast and barely keeping up. You know that sound they make when they're working overtime? That squeaky rubber sound was the only company I had since the radio reception out there is spotty at best. I was exhausted, having left later than planned, and it was around 11:30 at night. The roads were empty, which was both a blessing and a curse. No traffic to worry about, but also no one around if something went wrong. The road through that part of West Virginia is winding and dark. I mean pitch black except for where my headlights hit. No streetlights, no houses for stretches at a time, just dense forest on both sides. I knew the route pretty well, though, having driven it many times over the years. I was passing that old brick house. You know, the one with the weird little stone wall around it that looks like it's been there since the Civil War. That's always been my mental marker that I'm about halfway home. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just movement on the left side of the road. The rain was coming down so hard that I initially thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just a deer, I told myself, but something didn't feel right about the way it was moving. It wasn't darting across the road like a deer would. It was walking. I slowed down a bit, thinking it might be someone in hunting gear or a camouflage suit who'd gotten caught in the bad weather. But as I got closer and my headlights illuminated more of the figure, this cold feeling washed over me. The hairs on my arms and the back of my neck stood up straight. This wasn't a person, it couldn't be. The thing had this massive head that seemed to sit directly on its shoulders, like no neck at all. And those shoulders were impossibly broad, wider than any linebacker I've ever seen. It was tall too, way taller than me, and I'm 6'1", maybe 7 feet, maybe more. It's hard to judge size when your brain is trying to process something it's never seen before. But what really got me was the hair, or fur, or whatever you want to call it. It covered its entire body in these long, uneven strands that hung down in clumps like matted dreadlocks. In the rain, it looked even more bizarre, all heavy and dripping. The color was hard to make out in my headlights, but it was dark, like a muddy brown or almost black. The way it moved was all wrong. It swayed from side to side as it walked on 2 legs, but the motion wasn't human. And its arms, God, those arms hung down so low, almost to its knees, swinging in this exaggerated way with each step. It was like watching someone's attempt at mimicking human walking without ever having seen it done properly. I'm not ashamed to admit that I froze up. My brain was screaming at me to floor it and get the hell out of there, but I was just stuck. Time felt weird, like everything slowed down. The creature was only illuminated in my headlights for maybe 5 seconds as I drove past, but it felt like minutes. It didn't turn to look at me. It just kept walking toward the tree line like I wasn't even there. And somehow that was worse than if it had stared me down. Once I passed it, something kicked in. Curiosity, stupidity, whatever you want to call it. I immediately slowed down, made a U-turn, and pulled over to the shoulder, leaving my headlights pointed toward where I'd seen the thing enter the woods. The trailer made it awkward to maneuver, but I managed. In retrospect, it was probably the dumbest decision I've ever made in my life. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, engine idling, rain pounding on the roof of my truck, debating what to do. Part of me wanted to just drive away and pretend I hadn't seen anything, but I needed to know. I needed to confirm I wasn't losing my mind, so I grabbed the heavy-duty maglite I keep in my glove box and stepped out into the rain. The cold water immediately soaked through my jacket, but I barely noticed. My attention was fixed on the spot where the figure had disappeared into the trees. I walked to the edge of the road, scanning the area with my flashlight. The beam barely penetrated the dense vegetation, and the rain didn't help. Everything was just shadows and movement from the water hitting leaves. I called out, not sure why. Maybe a simple hello, or is anyone there? No response, just the sound of rain hitting the ground and leaves. That's when I heard it. Movement in the brush, not small like a squirrel or raccoon, but heavy. Something big was moving through the undergrowth about 30 yards in. Then came the sound that still wakes me up at night sometimes. It started as these deep, guttural grunts, like nothing I've ever heard come out of a human or any animal I know. Then it shifted into these high-pitched squeals that almost sounded like laughter, but distorted wrong. Imagine the worst, most unsettling laugh you've ever heard, then twist it into something that shouldn't be possible for vocal cords to produce. That's what it sounded like. I was frozen again, flashlight pointed in the direction of the sounds, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then came the knocking. It was loud, like someone taking two heavy logs and slamming them together. Boom, boom, boom. 3 in quick succession, then a pause, then another 3. This pattern continued for what must have been several minutes, though it felt like an eternity. The sound echoed through the trees, somehow cutting through the noise of the rain. Then, as suddenly as they started, the sounds stopped. Complete silence, except for the rain. That silence was somehow worse than the noises. At least with the sounds, I knew where it was. Now it could have been anywhere. That's when self-preservation finally kicked in. I backed up slowly toward my truck, keeping the flashlight beam sweeping back and forth, not turning my back to the woods until I reached the driver's side door. I practically threw myself inside, locked the doors, and sat there, shaking, soaking wet, and trying to process what had just happened. I don't know how long I sat there, maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour. Eventually, I put the truck in drive and got the hell out of there, checking my mirrors the whole way home, as if expecting to see that thing running after me on the road. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, jumping at every creak and groan of my house settling. By morning, I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined it all, stress, exhaustion, and the bad weather playing tricks on my mind. But I knew deep down that wasn't true. I'd seen something real out there, something that shouldn't exist. The next day, after getting maybe 2 hours of fitful sleep, I did something that probably sounds crazy. I went back, this time in daylight, and I brought my camera phone and a tape measure. I needed evidence, something to prove to myself I wasn't going insane. I found the spot easily enough. That old brick house was my landmark. I parked in roughly the same place and walked into the woods where I'd seen the figure disappear. The ground was still wet from the previous night's rain, and that's when I found them. Footprints, but not human footprints. They were huge, easily 15 inches long and incredibly wide. They had 5 toes, like a human print, but the proportions were all wrong. The stride length was massive too, much longer than mine, and they were clearly bipedal. 2 feet walking in a straight line, not 4 like you'd see with a bear. I took photos with my phone, using the tape measure in the frame for scale. As I followed the tracks deeper into the woods, they eventually disappeared, where the ground became rocky and covered with pine needles. I spent about 2 hours searching the area, but found nothing else except for a few broken branches high up, higher than a person could reach without a ladder. When I got home, I started researching. I'd heard stories about Bigfoot or Sasquatch before, of course, but I'd always written them off as campfire tales or misidentifications. Now I was reading every account I could find, looking for similarities to what I'd experienced. What really sent chills down my spine were the reports that described the same wood-knocking and bizarre vocalizations I'd heard. Some people called it samurai chatter or talking in tongues, but the descriptions matched exactly what I'd heard. That mix of deep grunts and high-pitched, almost laughing sounds, and the wood-knocking, apparently that's a known behavior reported by hundreds of witnesses across the country. I found other accounts from Tucker County and the surrounding areas that described creatures matching what I saw. The broad shoulders with no neck, the long hanging hair, the strange swaying gait. Some reports were decades old, others more recent. I've spent months now trying to make sense of what I experienced that night. I've told exactly 2 people, my brother and my closest friend. My brother looked concerned and suggested I might have seen a bear standing on its hind legs. My friend was more open to it, but still skeptical. I don't blame them. I would have reacted the same way before that night. But I know what I saw wasn't a bear, or a person in a suit, or any known animal. The creature's proportions were all wrong, its movement unnatural. And those sounds, I can still hear them sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep. I've gone back to that spot 3 more times since January, in daylight, hoping to find more evidence or maybe see it again from a safer distance. I haven't had any more encounters, but each time I go, I get this feeling of being watched. It's hard to explain, but it's this heavy, oppressive sensation that makes my skin crawl, like something intelligent is observing me from just beyond where I can see. I don't know what to do with this experience. I'm not looking to become some Bigfoot hunter or get on TV shows. I just want to understand what I saw that night. Was it some undiscovered species? Something else entirely? How has something that size remained hidden in the forests of West Virginia? The most unsettling part is that I drive that road regularly, and now every time I pass that spot, especially at night, I turn off the radio and listen. Every shadow in the tree line makes me flinch. I find myself scanning the woods, half afraid, half hoping to catch another glimpse. I know how this sounds. Before that night, I would have been the first person to laugh off Bigfoot stories as nonsense. Now I don't know what to believe. All I know is what I saw and heard, and it was real. Whatever it was out there in those woods, and for all I know, it's still there right now, watching and waiting. So that's my story. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I just needed to get it out there, to tell someone who might understand. Because the truth is, that 5-minute encounter has completely changed how I see the world. There are things out there we don't understand, things that don't fit into our neat categories of what should and shouldn't exist. And once you've seen something like that, you can never go back to not knowing. Story 4. Back in early January of 2011, my daughter Lily and I were living in this rental house way out in the boonies near Ork, Arkansas. If you've never heard of Ork, I'm not surprised. It's barely a dot on the map in the Ozark Mountains, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and outsiders stick out like a sore thumb. The house we rented was about as isolated as you could get, nearly a quarter-mile off the main road, at the end of this winding gravel driveway. The landlord had pitched it as private and peaceful, which was code for nobody will hear you scream. I'm only half joking. The property was surrounded by dense woods on 3 sides, with a small clearing around the house itself. In summer, it was actually pretty nice. Lily could play outside, and I could sit on the porch with a book. But in winter, different story. The trees lost their leaves, and you could see further into the woods, which somehow made it feel even more isolated. The wind would whistle through the bare branches, and sometimes at night, I'd hear things moving around outside. I always told myself it was just deer or raccoons. I'd grown up in Arkansas, spent my whole life there, so I was familiar with the local wildlife. I'd seen black bears from a distance, spotted bobcats crossing roads at dusk, and once even glimpsed what I'm pretty sure was a mountain lion. Wildlife didn't usually bother me. January 5th was a Wednesday. I remember because Lily had just gone back to school after Christmas break 2 days before. It had snowed lightly the night before, not enough to cancel school, just enough to dust everything with about an inch of white powder. It was cold, maybe around 30 degrees, and the sky was that weird grey colour that makes afternoon look like early evening. Lily's bus dropped her off at the bottom of our driveway around 3:30 every day. The bus driver, Mrs. Hanson, wouldn't drive up our long gravel driveway even in good weather. Liability issues, she said, so I'd walk down to meet Lily every afternoon. That day I bundled up in my heavy coat, pulled on my boots, and headed down the driveway around 3:20. The gravel crunched under my feet, and my breath made little clouds in the cold air. I remember thinking how quiet everything was, that muffled silence that only happens after a snowfall. I reached the main road just as the yellow school bus appeared around the bend. It stopped, the door opened with that distinctive hiss, and out hopped my little girl in her purple coat and unicorn backpack. Lily was 5 in kindergarten and full of stories about her day as usual. "Mommy, we made snowflakes with paper today, and Ms. Wilson says if it snows more, maybe we can build a snowman tomorrow at recess." I took her hand, and we started back up the driveway. Lily chattered away about which kids got in trouble and what she ate for lunch. Normal stuff. Everything was completely normal, until it wasn't. We were about 50 yards from the house when I first felt something was wrong. It's hard to explain, just this sudden heaviness in the air, like the atmosphere itself had thickened. The hairs on my arms stood up despite my coat. An instinct as old as humanity told me something was watching us. I slowed our pace slightly, trying not to alarm Lily, who was still talking about some boy who put glue in a girl's hair. My eyes scanned the tree line, expecting to see a deer or maybe a coyote. That's when I saw it. Our porch had 3 wooden steps leading up to it, with an overhang supported by 2 thick posts. And standing there, partially under the overhang near the bottom of the steps, was something. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. A bear standing on its hind legs. But no, this thing was massive, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, and standing perfectly upright in a way no bear could. It was covered in dark, shaggy hair, almost black but with hints of dark brown where the weak winter sunlight hit it. The hair was longer in some places, maybe 6 inches, and matted in others. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, wider than our front door, and its arms hung down much longer than a human's would, nearly to its knees. The hands, I could see them clearly, were enormous, with what looked like opposable thumbs, but it was the face that made my blood run cold. Most of it was hidden by hair, but I could clearly see a wide, flat nose, almost like a gorilla's, but different. Its forehead was broad and sloped backwards slightly, and the eyes, God, the eyes! Large and round, a deep amber-brown color, and disturbingly intelligent. They blinked, slowly, deliberately, as it watched us. I froze in my tracks. Lily, still holding my hand, stopped too and looked up at me, confused. "Mommy? What's wrong?" The creature didn't move. It just stood there, watching us with those eyes. I couldn't tell if it was curious or threatening or what. My mind was racing. I had my phone in my pocket but knew there was no service out here. Never was. The house was locked. My gun was inside. Lily was right there beside me. I squeezed Lily's hand and managed to keep my voice steady somehow. "Nothing's wrong, sweetie. I just remembered I left something in the mailbox. Let's go around to the side door, okay? Like a secret mission." "Okay." Thankfully, she thought it was a game. I kept myself between Lily and the creature as we slowly moved in a wide arc around the porch toward the side of the house. My heart was pounding so hard I swear you could have seen it through my coat. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew running could trigger a chase response. The thing's head turned slowly, following our movement, but it didn't otherwise change position, just watching, always watching with those eyes. We reached the side of the house where there was another entrance, a less used door that led into the mudroom. I fumbled with my keys, my fingers clumsy with fear, while trying to keep an eye on the front of the house. Lily was starting to pick up on my tension. "Mummy, you're squeezing too hard," she complained about my grip on her hand. "Sorry, baby," I whispered, finally getting the key in the lock and turning it. We slipped inside, and I locked the door behind us immediately, throwing the deadbolt too. "Go take off your coat and boots, then go play in your room for a bit, okay?" I told Lily, trying to sound normal. "I'll make you a snack in a few minutes." Once she was down the hall, I crept to the front window that overlooked the porch. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pull the curtain back an inch to peer out. The creature was still there, in the exact same position, not moving, just waiting. For what? I couldn't tell. It didn't look agitated or aggressive, but its sheer size and presence were terrifying enough. I watched for what felt like forever, but was probably only 5 minutes. Then, without any warning, it simply turned and walked. Not lumbered, not shuffled, but walked on 2 legs with an eerily smooth gait. Around the side of the house and into the tree line, its movement was fluid, almost graceful despite its bulk. And then, it was gone. I ran from window to window, trying to catch another glimpse of it, but saw nothing. It had vanished into the woods, as if it had never been there. That night, after I put Lily to bed, I sat in the living room with all the lights off and my .38 revolver in my lap. I'd inherited it from my dad years ago and knew how to use it, though I'd never had to. I sat there in the dark, straining to hear any sound outside that didn't belong. Every creak of the house settling made me jump. Every whisper of wind through the trees became footsteps in my mind. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. But I knew what I'd seen. I grew up in these woods. I know what a bear looks like, even standing up. I know what all the local wildlife looks like. This wasn't that. For the next week, I carried my gun in my coat pocket every time I walked down to meet Lily's bus. I kept scanning the tree line, jumping at shadows, but I never saw the creature again. I debated telling someone, the local sheriff maybe. But what would I say? "Hey, I saw Bigfoot in my front yard?" In a small town like Ork, that kind of talk would follow us forever. Lily would be the crazy lady's kid. I couldn't do that to her, so I kept quiet. I didn't renew our lease when it ended that summer, though. We moved into town to a duplex with neighbors right next door and streetlights outside. Lily was disappointed to leave the Woods house, but I never regretted that decision. Here's the thing that still haunts me. Those eyes. They weren't animal eyes. There was something behind them. Intelligence, awareness, something I can't quite put into words. Whatever I saw that day, it was thinking, observing, calculating. Sometimes I wonder if it had been watching us for days or weeks before I spotted it. The thought makes my skin crawl. Did it know our routines? Did it know when Lily's bus arrived, when I was alone in the house? I'm not saying it was Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. I don't know what it was. But I know what I saw, and it wasn't anything that's supposed to exist in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas. It wasn't anything that's supposed to exist anywhere. The weirdest part? Sometimes I dream about it still. In the dreams, I'm standing on that porch, and it's watching me from the tree line, just watching, never approaching, never threatening, just aware of me, as I am of it. I still live in Arkansas, though not near Ork anymore. I still go hiking occasionally, but I never go alone, and I never stay in the woods after dusk. And whenever I'm out there and that feeling comes over me, that prickly sensation of being watched, I turn back immediately. Because sometimes, when the wind is right and the woods are quiet, I swear I can feel those eyes on me again. Patient, waiting. For what, I don't know. and I hope I never find out. Lily is 16 now and thinks the whole thing is a funny story her paranoid mom made up. Maybe that's better. Maybe someday I'll convince myself it never happened. But then I'll catch a news story about strange sightings in the Ozarks, or hear a hunter's tale about weird noises in the deep woods, and I'll remember. I'll remember those eyes blinking slowly as they watched us. And I'll know that whatever it was, it's still out there somewhere in those ancient mountains. Watching, waiting. And sometimes, on cold January afternoons when the snow is fresh on the ground, I find myself wondering if it remembers me too. Story 5. So it's taken me a while to actually write this down. 5 years to be exact. I've told a few close friends, but every time I try to put it on paper, I just freeze up. The whole experience still feels so surreal, and I honestly worry people will think I'm making it up, or that I was hallucinating or something. But I wasn't. What I saw that day in the Bitterroot Mountains was real, and it's haunted me ever since. I was 24 at the time, on leave from the army, and eager to join my family's annual deer hunting trip. It's a tradition that goes back to when I was a kid, my dad, uncle, some family friends, and now me. We always hunt the same general area in Idaho, about 3 hours from where my parents live. It's pretty remote, accessible only by these old logging roads that get worse every year. We're talking serious backwoods. No cell service, barely passable trails, and the kind of isolation that usually feels peaceful. That October was unusually warm, and the deer season was already halfway through. My leave timing wasn't ideal for prime hunting, but I was just happy to be home and doing something normal after my last deployment. We drove our trucks as far as we could, about 8 miles in on roads that were basically just rutted dirt paths at that point. Then we hiked another few miles with all our gear to reach our usual camping spot near the ridge. The first day was uneventful. We set up camp, checked our rifles, caught up around the fire. Everyone turned in early since we planned to be up well before dawn. The plan was pretty standard. Spread out at first light, find good positions, and wait for deer to move through the valleys below. I woke up when my dad's watch alarm went off at 4:30 in the morning. It was that deep, pitch-black darkness you only get in the wilderness, the kind where you can't see your hand in front of your face. We had a quick, quiet breakfast, just coffee and energy bars, and headed out while it was still dark, using our headlamps on the lowest setting to avoid spooking any game. I was paired with my dad's friend Rick, but we had a loose agreement that we'd separate once we reached the hunting grounds to cover more area. The goal was to be in position by first light, which would give us the best chance at catching deer moving from their nighttime feeding areas back to daytime cover. Rick and I hiked about a mile east from camp, and when we got to a fork in the trail, we agreed to split up. He would take the north slope, and I would continue east along the ridge for another half mile or so. We planned to meet back at this same spot around noon, regardless of our luck. As I continued along the ridge, I remembered an old tree stand from previous years. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple wooden platform nailed between 2 trees that overlooked a natural clearing in the forest about halfway down the slope. I figured it might be a good spot to try, assuming it was still intact. It took me longer than expected to find it in the pre-dawn darkness. The trail had gotten more overgrown since the last time I'd been there, and I had to backtrack twice after losing the path. By the time I located the tree stand, the sky was just starting to lighten, that deep blue before actual sunrise. I was cutting it close on timing. The stand was still there, though it looked even more weathered than I remembered. The wooden slats were grey with age and exposure, and there was a concerning amount of give when I tested it with my weight. But it held, and I carefully climbed up with my rifle slung across my back. It wasn't very high, maybe 12 feet off the ground, but it gave me a perfect view of the clearing below and part of the slope leading down to a small creek. Dawn came slowly. The forest gradually took shape around me as the light filtered through the pine and fir trees. It was completely quiet except for the occasional whisper of wind through the branches. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Looking back, that should have been my first clue that something wasn't right. But at the time, I was just enjoying the stillness and the stunning view as the mountains emerged from darkness. By 7 o'clock, I'd been sitting motionless for almost 2 hours with no sign of deer. My legs were cramping and I was getting hungry. I quietly pulled an apple and a protein bar from my pack, figuring I'd give it another hour before changing positions. I finished the apple and tossed the core over the edge of the platform, not thinking much about it. I also had an orange that I peeled, dropping the peels below as well. Not exactly leave no trace principles, I know, but fruit scraps decompose quickly. After eating, I leaned back against the trunk of the tree and must have dozed off. The sun was warm on my face, and the lack of sleep from the night before caught up with me. I'm not sure how long I was out, maybe 20 minutes or so, but I woke with a jolt. What woke me wasn't a sound, it was a smell, an overwhelming pungent odor that hit me like a physical force. It's hard to describe accurately, but imagine a combination of wet dog, skunk, and something rotten. It was so strong it made my eyes water, and that's when I realized the forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no birds, nothing, just that oppressive, unnatural silence that makes the hair on your neck stand up. I sat perfectly still, barely breathing, my hand instinctively moving to my rifle. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The silence felt watchful, like the entire forest was holding its breath. That's when I saw it. About 25 feet downslope from my position, partially obscured by a fallen log, was something. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but as I focused, I realized it was standing upright on 2 legs. It was relatively small, maybe 5 feet tall, and covered in reddish-brown hair or fur that looked matted and uneven. The proportions were all wrong for a bear. The arms were too long, the legs too straight. It was inspecting the fruit peels I'd dropped earlier, picking them up and examining them carefully, almost delicately, with hands that looked disturbingly human-like. I couldn't see its face clearly from my angle, but I could see that it had a pronounced brow ridge and no neck to speak of. Its head seemed to sit directly on its shoulders. I was frozen in place, afraid that the slightest movement would alert it to my presence. My breathing was shallow, and my heart was hammering so hard in my chest that I was sure the creature would hear it. Then things got even more terrifying. There was a sudden crashing sound from the forest to my right, the unmistakable noise of something large moving quickly through underbrush with little concern for stealth. The smaller creature's head snapped up, and it made a soft, huffing sound. That's when the second creature appeared, and my entire understanding of what exists in our world shifted permanently. This thing was massive. It emerged from the tree line with startling speed for something so large, moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for its size. It stood at least 8 or 9 feet tall, covered in dark, almost black fur that hung longer around its shoulders and back. The musculature was what struck me most, the impossible thickness of its chest and shoulders, the powerful legs, the sheer physical presence that radiated primal strength. The smaller one made a series of complicated vocalizations, not quite speech, but definitely not animal sounds either. There was rhythm and pattern to it, almost like language. The larger creature responded with deeper, more guttural sounds that seemed to carry anger or frustration. I swear it felt like I was watching an argument. The larger one gestured forcefully toward the fruit peels, then swept its arm in the direction of the smaller one, as if scolding it. Their interaction had a disconcertingly human quality that left me feeling like an intruder witnessing something I wasn't meant to see. The smaller creature suddenly made a different sound, higher pitched and urgent, and pointed up the slope, directly at me. I'll never forget the moment when the large creature turned and looked straight at my position. Its eyes caught mine from across that distance, and there was unmistakable intelligence there. Recognition, awareness. It knew exactly what I was, and it studied me with an intensity that felt invasive, like it was cataloguing every detail of my appearance. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, we stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but remain locked in that gaze. Its eyes were deep set under that prominent brow, dark but reflective in the morning light. Then, without warning, both creatures moved. The smaller one darted away first, disappearing into the underbrush with surprising speed. The larger one held my gaze for one more second, then turned and followed with a fluid, ground-eating stride that covered distance alarmingly fast. Within moments, they were gone, leaving only swaying branches and disturbed vegetation as evidence they'd been there at all. I remained frozen in that tree stand for at least an hour afterward. My limbs felt like they were made of lead, and cold sweat had soaked through my shirt despite the warm day. I couldn't process what I'd seen. My mind kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe they were bears with some kind of disease that made them walk upright, or maybe I'd fallen asleep and had an extremely vivid dream. But I knew what I'd seen, and there was no rational explanation that fit. When I finally worked up the courage to climb down from the tree stand, my legs nearly gave out beneath me. I had to lean against the trunk for several minutes before I trusted myself to walk. My rifle felt useless in my hands. What good would it have done against creatures like that? I made my way back along the ridge, constantly scanning my surroundings and stopping at every sound. The forest had returned to normal. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, but it felt like a thin veneer of normalcy over something fundamentally changed. When I reached our meeting point, Rick was already there, sitting on a fallen log with his rifle across his knees. He looked up as I approached, and I immediately knew something was wrong. His face was pale, his expression strained. "You okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He shook his head slowly. "I saw something," he said, "up on the northeast slope. I don't know what it was." I sat down beside him, my legs finally giving out. "What did it look like?" "Big," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Really big, moving upright, too fast for how big it was, covered in dark fur." He looked at me, his eyes wide. "It wasn't a bear, Marcus. I've been hunting these mountains for 25 years. I know what a bear looks like." I nodded, my throat dry. "I saw them too, 2 of them." Rick's head snapped toward me. "2?" I told him everything, the smaller one investigating my apple core and orange peels, the arrival of the larger one, their interaction, the way they looked directly at me. As I spoke, Rick's expression shifted from shock to a strange kind of relief. "So I'm not crazy," he said when I finished. "If you are, then we both are." We sat in silence for a few minutes, processing. Then Rick stood up. "We need to get back to camp. I don't want to be out here anymore." I couldn't have agreed more. When we got back, the others were still out hunting. We packed up our gear without discussion, working quickly and efficiently. When my dad and uncle returned around 2 o'clock, they found us sitting by a newly built fire, our equipment ready to go. "What happened?" my dad asked, looking between us. "Someone get hurt?" Rick and I exchanged glances. "We need to head back," Rick said firmly. "Now." There were questions, of course, but something in our expressions must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation. By 3, we were hiking back to the trucks. No one spoke much on the trek out or during the drive home. Rick and I had agreed not to mention what we'd seen, at least not right away. It seemed too impossible, too outside the realm of normal experience. That night, after everyone else had gone to sleep, Rick found me sitting on my parents' back porch, staring at the stars. "You ever going back there?" he asked, lowering himself into the chair beside me. I shook my head. "No, never." "Me neither." He was quiet for a moment, then added, I've been hearing stories about those mountains my whole life. Strange sounds at night. Hunters finding their game, mysteriously taken. Campers packing up in the middle of the night because something was walking around their tents. He took a deep breath. I always thought they were just stories. They're not stories, I said, the image of those intelligent eyes still burning in my memory. 5 years have passed, and I've never returned to the Bitterroots. I've never gone hunting again, actually. Something about knowing those creatures are out there, watching, waiting, has taken all the joy out of being in the wilderness for me. I still can't explain what they were. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, some unknown primate species. The label doesn't really matter. What matters is that they exist, they're intelligent, and they know we're encroaching on their territory. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I can smell that distinctive musky odor in my bedroom. In those moments between sleep and wakefulness, I can still feel those eyes studying me, evaluating me, judging whether I was a threat. I wasn't. But I wonder what happens to those who are. Story 6. I've never been one to share personal stories online, especially something like this, but I can't keep it to myself anymore. What happened to me in the summer of 2017 has so fundamentally changed how I approach the outdoors that I feel compelled to finally write it down. I'm a military veteran, retired after 23 years of service. I've seen combat, faced life-threatening situations, and honestly believed nothing could rattle me anymore. I was wrong. It was early June when I decided to take my 19-year-old son Connor on a camping trip to Idaho. I'd been planning to show him this special spot in the North Fork area of Salmon Chalice National Forest that my father had taken me to when I was about Connor's age. It was remote, pristine, and had left such an impression on me that I'd always wanted to share it with my own son someday. The drive was longer than I remembered. We left our home in Montana early morning, expecting to arrive with plenty of daylight left, but between some road construction delays and my fuzzy memory of exactly which unmarked forest roads to take, we found ourselves still driving as the sun began to set. "Dad, are you sure this is the right way?" Connor kept asking, staring at his phone that had lost signal hours ago. "Yes, I recognize this ridge," I'd say, though truthfully, after 30-some years, everything looked both familiar and unfamiliar at once. The Forest Service roads gradually deteriorated from gravel to rutted dirt paths. My pickup truck handles rough terrain well, but even I was starting to question if we should turn back and find a more accessible spot for the night. But something kept pushing me forward, maybe stubbornness, maybe nostalgia. By the time we reached what I believed was the spot, a small clearing near a ridge overlooking a valley, darkness had almost completely fallen. The temperature had dropped considerably, and a slight breeze rustled through the pines surrounding us. "This is it?" Connor asked, clearly underwhelmed and tired from the long journey. "It looks different at night," I defended, though I couldn't be completely sure this was exactly the spot. "It'll be beautiful in the morning. Trust me." We were both exhausted, and setting up camp in the dark wasn't appealing. I suggested we sleep in the truck that night and set up proper camp at first light. Connor agreed and promptly reclined his seat, pulled his hoodie over his eyes, and was asleep within minutes. I wasn't quite ready to turn in. The mountain air felt good after hours in the truck, and I wanted to stretch my legs. Plus, I'd noticed some massive pine cones near the edge of our clearing, the kind my father and I used to collect on our trip. I thought it might be nice to gather a few as souvenirs. I left the truck running, with the headlights pointing into the forest to give me some light. Connor was fast asleep, so I didn't worry about waking him. The headlights carved a path maybe 30 yards into the dense trees before darkness swallowed everything beyond. The night was incredibly quiet up there. No distant traffic, no airplanes overhead, just the gentle whisper of wind through pine needles and the occasional creak of branches. It's the kind of silence you never experience in civilization, so complete that you become acutely aware of every sound you make. The crunch of my boots on pine needles, my breathing, even the rustle of my jacket as I bent down to pick up pine cones. I'd wandered maybe 20 yards from the truck, just at the edge of the headlight beams, when I found what I was looking for. Pine cones bigger than my hand, perfect specimens. I was gathering them into the crook of my arm, already having collected 5 or 6, when something changed. I didn't immediately understand what was different. Then it hit me. The forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no creaking branches, nothing. The silence was so sudden and complete that it made me straighten up and listen. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the slope directly above and behind me. Now, I've spent my entire life outdoors. I've encountered all kinds of wildlife in my time, especially during the 3 years I worked as a caretaker at a ranch outside Flagstaff. Bears, mountain lions, I've had close encounters with both. They never triggered panic in me. Caution, yes. Respect, absolutely. But never raw fear. This was different. These weren't the sounds of a 4-legged animal moving through the brush. These were bipedal footsteps, heel-to-toe impacts that sounded unmistakably like something walking on 2 legs. But they were too heavy, too widely spaced to be human, and they were coming directly toward me with purpose. I froze, straining to see through the darkness beyond the headlights. The footsteps continued, slow and methodical, each one causing a slight vibration I could feel through my boots. Whatever was making those footsteps was large, very large. Every instinct in my body screamed danger. The pine cones tumbled from my arms as I backed up toward the truck, unable to tear my eyes away from the darkness where the footsteps were coming from. I wish I could say I acted with the discipline and composure my military training should have instilled in me. But in that moment, I was reduced to pure animal instinct. I turned and ran for the truck. I yanked the driver's door open and threw myself inside, startling Connor awake. "What, Dad? What's wrong?" he mumbled, disoriented. I didn't answer. My hands were shaking so badly I struggled to get the truck into drive. The engine was already running, and I slammed my foot on the accelerator before Connor could even sit upright. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning on the loose dirt and pine needles. As we fishtailed and then gained traction, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. In the red glow of our taillights stood a figure. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, covered in dark hair, and standing upright on 2 legs. The glimpse lasted only a second or 2 before we were speeding away down the forest road, but it burned itself into my memory. I drove down that mountain road at a dangerous speed, the truck bouncing wildly over ruts and rocks. Connor was fully awake now, gripping the dashboard and repeatedly asking what was happening. "Dad, slow down! You're going to wreck us!" he shouted as we nearly missed a sharp turn. I couldn't answer him. My throat felt constricted, and my mind was racing, trying to process what I'd just seen. Nothing in my experience had prepared me for this. I'd heard stories, of course, everyone has, but I'd always dismissed them as campfire tales or misidentifications of bears. What I saw was not a bear. Bears don't stand that way. They don't move that way. They don't make those footsteps. I drove recklessly for about 20 minutes before my rational mind began to reassert itself. I realized I was putting us in actual danger with my driving and gradually slowed to a safer speed. Connor was staring at me with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Dad, seriously, what happened back there?" he asked, his voice quieter now. I took a deep breath. "I think I saw something in the woods," was all I could manage at first. Connor waited for more. When I didn't elaborate, he prompted, "Like what? A bear?" "No," I said firmly, "not a bear." "Then what?" I hesitated. How could I explain what I'd seen without sounding crazy? "I'm not sure," I finally said. "Something big, walking on 2 legs, coming toward me." Connor looked at me skeptically. "A person? Another camper?" "No," I shook my head. "Much bigger, much different." I could see the moment when Connor decided I was overreacting. His expression shifted from concern to something like mild embarrassment. "Dad, it was dark. You were probably seeing shadows from the headlights, or maybe a deer stood up on its hind legs. They do that sometimes." I didn't argue with him. What was the point? I knew what I'd seen, but I also knew how it would sound to anyone who hadn't seen it themselves. We drove all the way to the small town of North Fork, nearly 2 hours away, before I felt safe enough to stop. By then, it was well past midnight, but I found a motel with a vacancy sign still lit. As we checked in, the adrenaline that had been coursing through me finally began to subside, leaving me shaky and exhausted. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the taillights. I replayed those heavy footsteps in my mind, trying to find some rational explanation. But I knew what I'd experienced wasn't a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. It was real, solid, and terrifying in its unexpectedness. The next morning, over breakfast at a local diner, Connor tried to convince me we should go back and set up camp properly. "We drove all that way, Dad, and now we're just going home?" he said between bites of pancakes. "We can camp somewhere else," I offered. "There are plenty of good spots closer to town." Connor rolled his eyes. "What's the point? You wanted to show me that specific place. If we're not going there, we might as well just go home." I couldn't explain to him why I absolutely would not return to that spot. Not without weapons, not without preparation, not without knowing exactly what we might be facing. The fact that my own son didn't believe me made it worse somehow. We compromised by spending the day fishing at a popular spot near town before heading home the next day. The trip was salvaged, but not in the way I'd intended, and there was a strange tension between us that hadn't been there before. On the drive home, Connor finally brought it up again. "So what do you think you saw? Seriously?" I kept my eyes on the road. "I think you already decided I didn't see anything. I'm just asking," he said defensively. I sighed. "Have you ever heard stories about Bigfoot? Sasquatch?" Connor actually laughed. "Come on, Dad. Seriously? Bigfoot?" "I know how it sounds," I said quietly. "Yeah, it sounds crazy," he replied, turning to look out his window. "I didn't think you believed in that kind of stuff." "I didn't," I said, and that was the truth. Until that night, I'd never given the legendary creature much thought. I'd considered such stories to be exaggerations at best, complete fabrications at worst. Connor didn't bring it up again, and neither did I. When we got home, we unpacked and went back to our normal routines. But nothing was really normal for me anymore. In the weeks that followed, I found myself obsessively researching similar encounters in that region of Idaho. I discovered that the Salmon Chalice National Forest has a history of unexplained sightings dating back decades. I read accounts from hikers, hunters, and campers describing experiences eerily similar to mine: the heavy bipedal footsteps, the unnatural silence in the forest, the overwhelming sense of danger that defied rational explanation. Some of these accounts included physical evidence, unusually large footprints, strange structures of broken trees that no animal should have been able to create, and even audio recordings of vocalizations that made my skin crawl because they sounded so much like what I'd imagined might have come from the figure I saw. The more I read, the more convinced I became that what I'd experienced was real. Not a hallucination, not a misidentified bear, but an encounter with something science hasn't properly explained. It's been over 6 years since that night, and I haven't returned to that specific location. Connor occasionally teases me about my Bigfoot sighting, but he does it less often now. I think he senses how deeply it affected me. The experience has fundamentally changed how I approach wilderness areas. I no longer hike alone in remote regions. I always carry a sidearm, something I rarely did before, despite my military background. I pay attention to my surroundings in a way I never used to, constantly scanning, listening, analyzing. Would I ever go back to that part of Idaho? Maybe, but not without proper preparation, not without others who believe what I'm saying, and certainly not without the means to defend myself if necessary. Some people might say my reaction is extreme, that even if what I saw was real, these creatures have rarely harmed humans according to most accounts. But they weren't there that night. They didn't feel the primal fear that washed over me when those footsteps approached through the darkness. They didn't see that massive silhouette in the red glow of taillights, standing upright and watching as we fled. I've faced enemy fire. I've been in life-threatening situations during my military service. Nothing, absolutely nothing, has ever affected me the way that encounter did. And while I can't prove what happened, I know what I experienced was real. Whatever exists in those remote mountains, it deserves our respect and our caution. I'm sharing this story not to convince anyone, but because keeping it to myself has become too heavy a burden. Whether you believe me or not is up to you. But if you ever find yourself in the deep wilderness of the Salmon Chalice National Forest and the forest suddenly goes quiet around you, my advice is to get out, fast. Story 7. Back in March 2016, I was working as a seasonal tour guide and groundskeeper at this remote wilderness outpost in north-central Idaho, overlooking the Selway River. It was one of those places that truly deserves the term middle of nowhere. No roads in or out, just boat access and a narrow hiking trail that would make a mountain goat nervous. The isolation was exactly what I wanted at that point in my life. I'd been through a rough breakup, hated my desk job, and just needed to disconnect from everything for a while. The outpost consisted of a main cabin where I stayed, a small maintenance shed, and a viewing platform about half a mile up a ridge that offered these stunning panoramic views of the river canyon. My job involved taking small groups of tourists, usually no more than 4 or 5 people at a time, up to the platform, explaining the local ecosystem, wildlife, and history of the area. When I wasn't doing tours, I maintained the grounds and facilities, fixing leaky pipes, clearing the trail, that kind of thing. The weird stuff started happening on Monday, March 14th. I remember the date clearly because I'd called my mom that morning to wish her happy birthday. It was around 2 in the afternoon, and I was doing some routine maintenance at the staging point cabin, the small building where guests would wait before we headed up to the viewing platform. I was replacing some rotted wood on the deck steps when I heard this light tapping sound on the tin roof. At first I figured it was just starting to rain, but when I looked up the sky was completely clear. Then I noticed small pebbles and rocks bouncing down the steep slope behind the cabin, hitting the roof and rolling onto the wooden deck. I didn't think much of it at first. Probably just some small animal darting around up there, I thought. Maybe a squirrel or a marmot. I finished my work and headed back to the main cabin to grab lunch. That night, I was reading by oil lamp. We had a generator, but I tried to conserve fuel when possible. When I heard more rocks hitting the side of the cabin, these weren't small pebbles anymore. They sounded bigger, and they hit with purpose. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside, sweeping the beam across the tree line that bordered the small clearing where the cabin sat. Nothing. Just the wind rustling through the pines and that heavy silence that seems to amplify every little sound in the wilderness. I chalked it up to some rocks working loose on the slope above and went back inside, but I double-checked that my door was locked before going to bed. The next day, Tuesday, the rock throwing continued, and it definitely felt more deliberate. I'd be working somewhere, and suddenly rocks would start landing nearby, not hitting me, but close enough that it couldn't be coincidence. At one point, I was clearing debris from the trail to the viewing platform when a rock the size of my fist landed about 10 feet away from me. I spun around, expecting to see I don't know what. But again, nothing was there, just trees and silence. I've spent enough time in the backcountry to know that this wasn't normal wildlife behavior. Bears don't throw rocks. Neither do mountain lions or wolves. I started wondering if maybe some local kids had hiked in and were messing with me. But that seemed unlikely given how remote we were. The nearest town was almost 40 miles away, and the trail to reach us was brutal. Certainly not something bored teenagers would trek just to play a prank. By Wednesday, I was on edge. The radio was my only connection to the outside world, and I considered calling in to report the strange activity, but what would I say? Hey, I think someone's throwing rocks at me. They'd think I was losing it out there alone. So I kept quiet and tried to focus on preparing for Thursday's tour. I had 2 guests coming in by boat, a couple from California who'd booked months in advance for a specialized wildlife photography tour. Thursday morning dawned grey and misty. The weather report had called for rain later, but for now it was just heavy. Low clouds hanging in the canyon, creating this eerie, muffled silence. Even the birds seemed quieter than usual. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I swept the deck of the staging cabin and organized the information packets I'd give to my guests. The tour boat arrived just before 10. My guests were Richard and Karen Fletcher, a retired couple from San Francisco. He was a former investment banker who'd taken up wildlife photography, and she was a bird enthusiast, hoping to spot some of the rarer species that nest in the canyon. They seemed nice enough, if a bit overdressed for a wilderness hike in their matching North Face jackets and brand new hiking boots. "Welcome to Selway Outpost," I greeted them as they climbed up from the dock. "I'm Lucas. I'll be your guide today." The boat operator, Mike, gave me a nod. "I'll be back at 3 to pick them up," he said, then added in a lower voice, "Storm's coming in later. Don't linger up on that ridge too long." He pushed away from the dock and headed back downriver, the sound of his motor gradually fading until it was swallowed by the canyon. I gave the Fletchers a quick orientation at the staging cabin, going through the usual safety briefing and overview of what they might see. As I was gathering my backpack with water and first aid supplies, I heard it again, the distinct sound of rocks hitting the roof. The Fletchers heard it too. "What was that?" Karen asked, looking up. "Probably just some loose rocks falling from the slope," I said, trying to sound casual. "Happens all the time." Richard frowned. "Sounded like someone threw something." I forced a smile. "Just the mountain settling. This area has a lot of erosion." We set off up the trail to the viewing platform. It's not an especially difficult hike, about 20 minutes at a steady pace. But the Fletchers stopped frequently to take photos and catch their breath. I didn't mind. It gave me a chance to scan our surroundings. The whole time I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. About halfway up, we stopped at a small clearing that offered a nice view of the river below. As Karen was photographing some wildflowers, I heard what sounded like a branch snapping somewhere in the trees behind us. I whipped around, my heart suddenly pounding. "Everything okay?" Richard asked, noticing my reaction. "Yeah, fine," I said, trying to sound normal. "Just thought I heard something, probably a deer." But it didn't sound like a deer. Deer moved delicately through the forest. This was heavier, more deliberate. I hurried the Fletchers along, suddenly eager to reach the viewing platform where we'd have better visibility. We arrived at the platform around 11:30. It's a simple wooden structure, about 20 feet by 15 feet, with a partial roof for shelter and low railings around the edges. The view is spectacular, a panoramic vista of the Selway River winding through the canyon, surrounded by dense forest and rugged peaks. On a clear day, you can see for miles, but that day, with the low clouds, our visibility was limited to maybe half a mile at best. I began my usual spiel about the local ecosystem, while the Fletchers set up Richard's camera on a tripod. They were hoping to catch some wildlife shots, eagles soaring in the canyon, or maybe deer coming down to the river to drink. What we saw instead still haunts me. We'd been on the platform for about 20 minutes. The conversation had dwindled to comfortable silence as we all stood quietly, watching the river and listening to the faint sound of rushing water far below. That's when we heard it, a deep rustling sound from across the canyon, about 200 yards away on the opposite slope. At first, I thought it was just the wind picking up ahead of the storm. But then Richard pointed. "Look at those trees moving there." Along a narrow gully that cut down the opposite slope, several large trees were shaking violently. Not swaying like they would in the wind, these were being physically moved. Their tops bending back and forth with such force that it looked like something massive was pushing through them. "What is that?" Karen whispered, raising her binoculars. "A bear?" Before I could answer, we saw it. Emerging briefly on what appeared to be a game trail that crossed the gully, a large upright figure moved with incredible speed. It was visible for only a few seconds before disappearing into thicker vegetation downslope. But in that brief moment, all three of us saw it clearly. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't move like that. This thing was on two legs, moving with purpose downhill toward the river. Its arms, and they were definitely arms, not front legs, swung fluidly with each enormous stride as it barreled through the underbrush. "Oh my God!" Karen gasped, lowering her binoculars. "Did you see that? What was that?" Richard had gone pale. He was frantically adjusting his camera, trying to zoom in on the spot where the figure had disappeared. "Lucas, what the hell was that?" I couldn't answer. My mouth had gone dry and my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. What we'd seen was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with dark hair covering its body. It moved with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for something so large. The way it navigated that steep, treacherous slope with such ease, nothing human moves like that. "We need to go," I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "Right now." "But what was it?" Karen insisted, still staring across the canyon. "That wasn't a bear. It was walking upright." "I don't know," I said, already gathering their things, "but we're leaving. Now." That's when we heard it. A deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Not quite a roar, not quite a scream. Something in between that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It echoed through the canyon, bouncing off the walls until it was impossible to tell which direction it had come from. We didn't wait to hear it again. We practically ran down that trail, the Fletchers stumbling in their new boots, me constantly looking over my shoulder. The mist had thickened, reducing visibility even further, and every shadow in the trees looked like a massive figure ready to lunge at us. When we reached the staging cabin, I immediately locked us inside and grabbed the emergency radio. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate it. "Selway, outpost to base. Come in," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Emergency situation. Need immediate pickup." After a few agonizing seconds of static, the radio crackled to life. "Base to Selway. What's the emergency?" I hesitated. How do you report something like this without sounding completely insane? "Potentially dangerous wildlife sighting," I finally said. 3 witnesses. Need boat extraction as soon as possible." "Copy that, Selway. Sending Mike back up. ETA 90 minutes due to weather conditions. Secure your location and maintain radio contact." 90 minutes. We'd have to wait 90 minutes in that tiny cabin, knowing that thing was out there somewhere. I checked that the doors and windows were secure, while the Fletchers huddled together at the small table, speaking in hushed tones. "What did we see out there, Lucas?" Richard finally asked. "And don't tell me it was a bear. I've photographed black bears, brown bears, grizzlies. That wasn't a bear." I sat down heavily across from them. "Honestly, I don't know. But I've been having strange experiences here the past few days. Rocks being thrown at the cabins, sounds in the woods. I thought maybe it was animals or the wind, but now..." Karen's eyes widened. "You think whatever we saw was throwing rocks at you? Like, intelligently?" I nodded slowly. "Maybe. Yeah. So we're talking about... what? Bigfoot? Sasquatch?" Richard's voice had an edge of disbelief, but his expression told a different story. He had seen it too. "I don't know what to call it," I said. "I just know what I saw, what we all saw." The next hour and a half was the longest of my life. We sat in that cabin, jumping at every sound. Twice we heard heavy footsteps on the path outside, and once something large bumped against the back wall of the cabin so hard that a framed map fell off the wall. None of us spoke much. What was there to say? When we finally heard Mike's boat approaching, the relief was overwhelming. We practically ran to the dock, scanning the tree line the entire time. I kept expecting to see that massive figure emerge from the forest, but it didn't. As we pulled away from the dock, I looked back at the outpost. Through the mist, I could just make out the silhouette of the cabins against the backdrop of dense forest. And for a brief moment, so brief I've spent years wondering if I imagined it, I thought I saw a large, dark figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching us leave. I quit that job 2 weeks later, couldn't bring myself to go back out there alone after what happened. The company that ran the outpost tried to convince me to stay, but when I insisted on having a second staff member assigned there at all times, and they refused, I handed in my resignation. The Fletchers sent me some of their photos afterward, hoping they might have accidentally captured something on camera, but there was nothing conclusive, just blurry shots of moving trees and shadows that could be anything. They did, however, include a handwritten note with the photos. "We know what we saw. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I've never been back to the Selway. Never want to go back. I live in Colorado now, working at a busy state park where there are always people around. I still love the outdoors, still hike and camp, but never alone and never in places that remote. Sometimes I second-guess myself, wonder if the isolation was getting to me, if we all just saw a bear standing momentarily on its hind legs. But then I remember the way it moved, the purpose in its stride, the intelligence behind those rock throws. And I know that the Selway Wilderness is home to something that most people don't believe exists. That area, miles of uninhabited terrain in all directions, accessible only by boat or difficult trails. It's the perfect habitat for something to exist unnoticed by the wider world. Something that doesn't want to be found, but occasionally, whether by accident or curiosity, reveals itself to the rare human who ventures into its territory. I don't expect everyone to believe my story. I probably wouldn't if I hadn't lived it. But I know what I saw that day, and I know I'm not going back to find out more. Story 8. I'm still trying to process what happened to me last weekend. I know it sounds crazy, but I need to get this off my chest. I've been camping hundreds of times in my life, but nothing like this has ever happened before, and I'm honestly not sure I'll ever go back to that particular spot again. So my friends Emma and Lily had been planning this camping trip for weeks. We'd been talking about getting away from everything. No phones, no internet, just the three of us reconnecting with nature and each other. We're all pretty experienced campers, having grown up in rural Oregon, so when Emma found this supposedly gorgeous but lesser-known campground about 2 hours from Portland, we were all in. The drive there was beautiful. It was early October, so the leaves were just starting to change, and the forest was this amazing mix of green and gold. The road got progressively narrower as we went deeper into the forest, and by the time we reached the campground, we were basically on a dirt path. That should have been our first clue that this place was more remote than we'd anticipated. When we pulled into the campground, I immediately noticed how empty it was. Like, completely empty. Not a single other car or tent in sight. Emma checked the registration post, and there wasn't a single name on the sign-in sheet except for ours. We figured it was just because it was getting colder, and most people aren't crazy enough to camp in October in the Pacific Northwest. Plus, it was a Friday, so we thought maybe others would show up later. "Perfect," Lily had said. "We'll have the whole place to ourselves." I remember thinking how peaceful it was. The campground was nestled in this valley, surrounded by tall pines, with a small creek running about 50 yards from our site. It was so quiet you could hear the water babbling over the rocks. We spent the afternoon setting up our tent, one of those bigger 4-person ones so we'd have space for our gear, and gathering firewood. By the time the sun started setting, we had a nice fire going and were cooking hot dogs and warming up some beans. The weird thing is, I remember noticing how quiet it had gotten. Usually in the forest, especially at dusk, you hear all kinds of sounds: birds, squirrels, the occasional deer moving through the underbrush. But as darkness fell, it was like everything went silent. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I just assumed it was because of the dropping temperature. We stayed up late, talking and laughing around the fire, sharing stories and passing a flask of whiskey between us. It was one of those perfect camping nights. Crisp air, clear sky full of stars, good friends. By around 11:30, we were all yawning and decided to turn in. I've always been a heavy sleeper, like seriously heavy. My roommates in college used to joke that I could sleep through a nuclear apocalypse. Emma and Lily know this about me, which is why they always insist I sleep in the middle when we camp together. They say I'm like a human hot water bottle. So we got in the tent, zipped up our sleeping bags, and said goodnight. I remember falling asleep almost immediately, feeling warm and content between my two friends. This is where things get weird, because according to Emma and Lily, I slept through almost the entire thing. They told me what happened the next morning, and honestly, I still have goosebumps thinking about it. They said they'd been asleep for maybe an hour when they heard the first howl. Emma said it wasn't like a wolf or coyote. She's heard plenty of those before. This was deeper, more guttural, and somehow intelligent sounding. That's the word she used, and Lily agreed. They both woke up but didn't say anything to each other at first, each thinking maybe it was just a weird dream. Then it happened again, closer this time. Lily described it as a cross between a howl and a grunt, something she'd never heard before. They whispered to each other, asking if the other had heard it too. They tried to wake me up, but apparently I just mumbled something incoherent and rolled over, dead to the world. The third time they heard it, it was clear that whatever was making the sound was circling our campsite. Emma said she could hear heavy footsteps crunching on the pine needles and fallen leaves around our tent. They were too scared to unzip the tent and look outside, which I totally understand. I would have been terrified too. Lily said they huddled together, whispering about what to do. They tried waking me again, shaking me harder this time, but I still didn't budge. She told me she's never seen anyone sleep so deeply, especially during something so terrifying. What happened next still makes my skin crawl. According to both of them, they could hear something large moving around our tent, circling it slowly. When it went to one side, they would instinctively move to the opposite side. Emma said it felt like it was trying to find the best way to get to us. At one point, they heard sniffing, like really loud sniffing, right against the tent wall. Then, and this is the part that freaks me out the most, something pressed against the side of the tent right where I was sleeping. They said it was a large impression, pushing the tent fabric in so far that it actually made me roll over in my sleep. But I still didn't wake up. Lily was in tears telling me this part. She said she was convinced we were going to die, that whatever was out there was going to tear through the tent at any moment. Emma had her pocket knife out, which would have been useless against what they were describing, and they were both frozen in fear. For what they estimate was about 2 hours, this thing circled our tent, occasionally making those strange, howling, grunting sounds, pushing against the tent and sniffing around. Then, the weirdest thing started happening. They started hearing soft thuds on top of the tent. At first, they thought it might be starting to rain, but then they realized it was dropping pine cones on our tent, not throwing them forcefully, just dropping them, like it was playing some kind of game. Emma said it felt almost like it was trying to get a reaction from us. When they stayed quiet and still, it would drop another pine cone, or make another sound, or push against the tent again. They counted at least 15 pine cones that were dropped onto our tent throughout the night. Around 3 in the morning, they said the sounds started to get more distant. The creature, or whatever it was, seemed to be moving away from our campsite, though they could still hear its distinctive howl in the distance. This is where my memory picks up. I woke up around 4 a.m., needing to pee, probably from all the beer I'd had earlier. I remember being annoyed that Emma and Lily were both wide awake. "What are you guys doing up?" I asked, groggy and confused. They just looked at me with these wide, terrified eyes. Before they could answer, I heard it, a long, deep, howling sound coming from somewhere in the forest. It was distant but undeniable. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not a wolf, not a bear, not any animal I could identify. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. "That's what we've been dealing with all night while you've been snoring away," Lily whispered back, her voice shaking. They quickly filled me in on what had happened, and I felt this cold dread washing over me. I'd camped in these woods my entire life and never encountered anything like what they were describing. The fact that something had been pushing against me while I slept made me feel violated and terrified. We stayed huddled in the tent until first light, around 6:30 in the morning. None of us slept a wink after I woke up. Every time we heard a branch snap or leaves rustle, we'd freeze, hardly daring to breathe. When it was finally light enough to see, we cautiously unzipped the tent and peered out. The campsite looked normal at first glance, but when we stepped outside, we noticed the pine cones. There were at least a dozen scattered around our tent, which seemed odd given there weren't any pine trees directly above us. But what really got to us was the footprints. The ground around our campsite was soft, and there were these massive, barefoot-looking prints circling our tent. They were huge, easily twice the size of my boot, and deeply pressed into the soil, suggesting whatever made them was extremely heavy. We didn't even bother with breakfast. We packed up our gear in record time, constantly looking over our shoulders and jumping at every sound. The whole time I kept apologizing for sleeping through most of it, and they kept insisting it wasn't my fault. But I could tell they were frustrated and maybe even a little angry that they'd been terrified all night while I was peacefully sleeping. The drive back was tense. We tried to come up with rational explanations for what had happened. Maybe it was a bear, but bears don't howl like that. A mountain lion, they don't drop pine cones on tents. Some local trying to scare us? But the footprints were too big, and who would spend hours in the cold night just to frighten some random campers? It wasn't until we were about halfway home that Emma finally said what we'd all been thinking. "Guys, I think it might have been a Sasquatch." In any other context, I would have laughed. Bigfoot? Seriously? But after what happened, after seeing those footprints and hearing that unidentifiable howl with my own ears, I couldn't dismiss it out of hand. Lily had been quiet for most of the drive, but then she said something that made my blood run cold. "If it was a Sasquatch, why didn't it hurt us? It had hours to do whatever it wanted." We've talked about it extensively since then, read up on similar encounters, watched documentaries, and even reached out to some local Bigfoot research groups. The consensus seems to be that if it was a Sasquatch, it was probably just curious about us. They say these creatures are intelligent and generally non-aggressive, more interested in observing humans than harming them. But that doesn't explain why it seemed so fixated on me specifically, why it pushed against me multiple times through the tent fabric, why I slept so heavily through something that kept my friends wide awake with terror. It's been a week since our camping trip, and I still can't shake the feeling that something connected with me that night. Emma and Lily have both had nightmares about it, but weirdly, I haven't. In fact, I've been sleeping more soundly than ever, which is starting to freak me out in its own way. We've all agreed we're never going back to that campground again. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night in my apartment, I swear I can hear a faint howling in the distance, and occasionally in the morning I find pine needles in my hair or on my pillow, even though there isn't a pine tree anywhere near my building. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know what was circling our tent or why it seemed interested in me, but I do know this. Something was there with us, something intelligent, something that wanted to make contact. And sometimes I get the strangest feeling that whatever it was is still watching me, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known again. I haven't told Emma and Lily about the pine needles or the howling I think I hear at night. They're freaked out enough as it is. But I can't help wondering, what if it followed me home? What if whatever connection was formed that night isn't over? I'm writing this down partly to see if anyone else has had a similar experience, and partly because I'm scared that something might happen to me. If it does, at least there will be a record of how it started. I still can't explain why I slept through most of it, why I didn't wake up when it was touching me through the tent. Sometimes I think back to that night and wonder if maybe I wasn't really asleep at all. Maybe, on some level I can't consciously access, I was aware of what was happening. Maybe I was communicating with it somehow. All I know for sure is that something found us in those woods. Something curious, something intelligent. And I can't shake the feeling that it's not done with me yet. Story 9. It was just after midnight, and I was exhausted. I'd been debating whether to stay overnight at my friend's, but I had to work the next morning, so I decided to make the drive. Highway 50 is pretty isolated, just a two-lane road cutting through dense forest and marshland for long stretches. You don't get much traffic out there, especially that time of night. I had my high beams on and was probably going about 90 kilometers per hour. The radio was playing softly. I remember it was some late-night talk show discussing hunting season, which had just opened. I was fighting to stay alert, occasionally cracking my window to let the cold air keep me awake. The thing is, I've driven that stretch of road hundreds of times. I grew up around Sandy Bay, and I know all the wildlife you might encounter. Deer, moose, bears, coyotes. I've had close calls with all of them. What I saw that night wasn't anything I recognized. I first noticed movement on the right shoulder of the road, about 50 meters ahead. My headlights caught something, and I immediately slowed down, thinking it was a deer. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't standing like a deer. It was hunched over something on the ground. My first thought was that it must be a bear scavenging roadkill. We get black bears around there, and they sometimes come to the roadside for easy meals. But even as I thought that, something felt wrong. The shape wasn't right. When I was about 20 meters away, I could see it more clearly. It was squatting on its haunches beside what looked like a dead raccoon or maybe a fox. It was holding the carcass with both hands, not paws, hands, and its head was bent down, eating. That's when I realized what I was looking at, and my blood went cold. I swerved instinctively, jerking the wheel to the left to avoid hitting it. My tires screeched, and I felt my heart slam against my ribs. I nearly went into the opposite ditch, but managed to correct and stay on the road. As my car veered past, not more than 10 feet away from this thing, it slowly lifted its head and looked directly at me. I only saw its face for a split second as I drove by, but that image is burned into my brain. It was covered in dark hair, not fur, but hair, that was matted and hung down over its features. The face was flat, almost gorilla-like, with a pronounced brow ridge. Its eyes were small and set deep, reflecting my headlights with a dull reddish glow. Its nose was flat and wide, and its mouth... God, its mouth was open, showing teeth that were smeared with blood from whatever it had been eating. What struck me most, besides the absolute wrongness of what I was seeing, was that it showed no fear, no surprise, not even curiosity. It just turned its head slowly to watch me pass, like it was completely unconcerned by my presence, like it owned that road more than I did. As my car flew past it, I noticed something else strange. There was a cloud of mosquitoes swarming around it. In late October, when it had been hovering around freezing for weeks, there shouldn't have been any mosquitoes, but they were there, swarming around this thing like a halo. About 75 feet past it, my brain finally caught up with what my eyes had seen. I slammed on the brakes without thinking. My tires locked up and I skidded to a stop, nearly spinning out. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. Some part of my mind was screaming at me to floor it, to get away, but another part needed to confirm what I'd seen. I needed to know I wasn't hallucinating from fatigue. I looked in my rearview mirror. The creature was still there, illuminated by my taillights. But now it was standing up. It rose from its squatting position with this fluid, unsettling grace that nothing that big should possess. Standing fully upright, it was massive, well over 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung down past its knees. For one horrible moment, it just stood there in the red glow of my taillights, staring at my car. The roadkill was still in one of its hands, dripping something dark onto the pavement. Then it took a step toward me. That broke the spell. I stomped on the gas pedal so hard I felt something in my ankle pop. My tires spun against the asphalt before catching, and I shot forward, my engine screaming. I drove like a maniac, probably going 140 or more, taking the curves way too fast, constantly checking my mirror to see if it was somehow following me. It took me about 25 minutes to reach my parents' house in Sandy Bay, a drive that normally takes 40. By the time I pulled into their driveway, I was sobbing and hyperventilating. I couldn't feel my hands. I just sat there in the car with the engine running for God knows how long, unable to move, terrified that if I got out, that thing would somehow be there waiting for me. Eventually, my mom noticed my headlights through the window and came out to see what was wrong. I was such a mess that she thought I'd been in an accident or that someone had attacked me. She practically carried me inside. I tried to tell her what happened, but the words wouldn't come out right. When I finally managed to explain what I'd seen, I could see the change in her expression. Not disbelief exactly, but concern. The kind of concern you show someone who's had a breakdown or a hallucination. "Amanda," she said, "you're exhausted. You've been working too hard, and driving at night when you're this tired isn't safe." "Mom, I know what I saw," I insisted. "It was a Sasquatch, a sorbet. They're real." The term sorbet is what the old-timers around here call them. It's been part of local law for generations, especially among the indigenous communities. I'd heard stories growing up, but had always written them off as campfire tales, meant to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. My mom made me some tea and tried to calm me down. She didn't outright say I was imagining things, but I could tell she thought fatigue had made me see something that wasn't there. My dad was more blunt when he got up to see what the commotion was about. "Amanda, there's no such thing as Sasquatches," he said flatly. "You probably saw a bear standing on its hind legs. They can look very human-like in the dark." "It wasn't a bear," I said. "Bears don't have hands. Bears don't stand over 7 feet tall. Bears don't eat roadkill with their hands, while mosquitoes swarm them in freezing weather." But the more I tried to convince them, the more concerned they looked. Eventually I gave up. They let me sleep in my old room and I didn't argue. There was no way I was driving back to my apartment that night. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing's face looking at me. Those eyes, the blood on its teeth. I kept thinking about how it had started walking toward my car. What would have happened if I'd stayed? What would have happened if my car had broken down on that lonely stretch of road? The next morning, I felt a little better in the daylight. I almost convinced myself that maybe I had been overtired, that maybe I had seen a bear or even a particularly tall person in dark clothing who had been hunting or something, but deep down, I knew better. I called in sick to work and drove back to the spot in broad daylight. I don't know what I expected to find. Footprints, maybe, or the remains of whatever it had been eating. But there was nothing, just an empty stretch of highway that looked completely ordinary in the daylight. I spent the next few weeks researching Sasquatch sightings online. There have been dozens of reports in the Manitoba wilderness over the years. Some of them describe exactly what I saw: the height, the movement, the lack of fear around humans. A few even mentioned the mosquitoes, which apparently are attracted to them regardless of the season. I found an online forum where people share their encounters, and I was shocked by how many sightings were similar to mine. Some people theorize that they're drawn to roadkill, that highways cutting through their territory have created an easy food source. Others think they're some kind of undiscovered primate species that's adapted to the harsh northern climate. I tried telling a few friends about what happened, but I got the same reaction as from my parents: concern, gentle skepticism, suggestions that maybe I should talk to someone about stress or anxiety. So I stopped talking about it. But I haven't stopped thinking about it. Not for a single day since it happened. I've changed my habits. I never drive that highway at night anymore. If I visit friends in Winnipeg, I make sure I leave early enough to get home before sunset, or I stay overnight. I keep my doors locked, even in daylight. I've started carrying bear spray in my car. My friends think I've developed some kind of anxiety disorder, and maybe I have, but it's not without reason. Sometimes I wonder if it recognized me somehow, if it remembers my car, my face, if it's waiting for another chance encounter. I wonder how many other people have seen it over the years and stayed quiet out of fear of ridicule. I wonder how many people have encountered it and weren't as lucky as I was. The Manitoba wilderness is vast and largely unexplored. There are thousands of square kilometers where humans rarely set foot, especially in the colder months. Who knows what lives out there, watching us from the trees, occasionally venturing to the edges of our world when hunger or curiosity drives them. I know what I saw that night. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person. It was something else. Something that most people refuse to believe exists, despite centuries of consistent sightings and stories. Something that makes its home in our forests and marshes, that watches our roads, and sometimes feeds on the animals we kill with our vehicles. I still have nightmares about those eyes looking into mine, about what might have happened if I'd stopped longer, or if my car had broken down, about those long arms reaching for my door handle, those bloody teeth smiling as the lock gave way. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I know how it sounds. But if you ever find yourself driving along Highway 50 near Sandy Bay after dark, keep your doors locked and your eyes on the road. And if you see something moving on the shoulder, something hunched over and too big to be a normal animal, don't stop. Don't look too closely. Just keep driving as fast as you safely can until you're far, far away. Because they're out there. The Sorbets, the Sasquatch. Whatever you want to call them, they're real and they're watching us. Indeed, Stai Story 10. Ustachi, I've been debating whether to share this for weeks now. Part of me thinks people will just laugh or say we're making it up for attention. But I need to tell someone besides our immediate circle, and this community seems like the right place. My wife Jill and I got married back in June. We'd been planning our wedding for over a year, but honestly, I was more excited about our honeymoon. We both love hiking and photography, so we decided on a 2-week trip through Oregon's mountains. We're from Winnipeg, and while Manitoba has its charm, we wanted something different. Tall trees, wild landscapes, and that Pacific Northwest vibe. The first week was perfect. We stayed at this cute cabin near Mount Hood, hiked every day, and took hundreds of photos. Jill's the better photographer, but I enjoy it too. We have this thing where we take turns being the photographer and the subject. It's silly, but we have fun with it. On our 8th day, we were driving along this scenic highway. I think it was Highway 26, winding through the Mount Hood National Forest. It was around 4 in the afternoon, and the light was doing that golden thing that photographers love. We rounded a bend and saw this incredible view. a valley stretching below us with mountains in the background. I pulled over at a little turnout. There wasn't anyone else around, which wasn't surprising since it was a Tuesday in a pretty remote area. Jill grabbed her good camera and I took my phone. We planned to get shots of each other with the valley as backdrop. "This is perfect," Jill said, climbing up on this rocky embankment about 20 feet from the car. The spot gave her maybe an extra 6 or 7 feet of elevation, making for an even better composition with the valley behind her. I stayed below, taking several shots of her standing there. She was wearing her bright blue hiking jacket, a splash of color against all that green and brown. The light was hitting her just right, and I was clicking away, telling her to turn this way and that. "Got it," I called up after taking maybe a dozen photos. "Want to switch?" We traded places and then continued our drive. Nothing unusual happened. Nothing felt off. We didn't hear any strange noises or notice anything weird. Just a quick 15-minute photo stop before moving on to our next destination. That was it. Completely normal. We finished our honeymoon, flew back to Winnipeg, and settled into married life. We put together a digital album of our favorite photos and shared it with friends and family through a cloud link. 3 days after sharing the album, my phone buzzed with a text from our friend Kathy. "Call me ASAP about your honeymoon photos." I called her right away, thinking maybe there was something wrong with the link. "Have you really looked at photo number 87? She asked, without even saying hello. "Which one is that?" I asked, opening the album on my laptop. "The one of Jill on the rocks with the valley behind her." I found it and started scanning the image. "What am I looking for?" "Behind her, Mary. Look behind her to the left, in the trees." At first, I didn't see anything. Then Kathy told me to zoom in on the section of forest behind and slightly to the left of where Jill was standing. That's when I saw it. And honestly, my blood went cold. Partially hidden behind a large pine tree, but clearly visible, was a dark figure, standing upright, watching. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, more to myself than to Kathy. I hung up and called Jill into the room. She was as shocked as I was. We spent the next hour examining the photo, zooming in, adjusting contrast, trying to convince ourselves it was just a shadow or a weirdly shaped tree. But it wasn't. Whatever this was had a distinct form. It was dark brown or black, standing on 2 legs, with what appeared to be broad shoulders. And it was big, based on its position behind Jill in the photo and the relative size of the trees. This thing had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. "How did we not see this?" Jill kept asking. "How could we miss something that big standing right there?" That's the part that disturbs me most. This wasn't some tiny detail in the background. This figure was maybe 50 yards behind Jill, partially concealed by a tree, but still, how did we both miss it? The area wasn't densely forested at that spot. There was plenty of visibility. We've gone over every detail of that stop. The weather was clear. It was broad daylight. Neither of us remembers hearing anything unusual. No branches breaking, no strange calls. There was a light breeze, but nothing that would have masked sounds of something that size moving around. And we didn't smell anything unusual either. I've read that Sasquatch supposedly have a strong, musky odor, but there was nothing like that. Just the usual forest smells, pine and dirt and fresh air. We've examined every inch of that photo. The figure is partially obscured, but what you can see is unmistakable. Broad shoulders, a large, somewhat conical head, dark fur or hair covering its body, standing perfectly upright in a way that's distinctly non-bear-like. After our initial shock, we showed the photo to more friends. Some immediately said, "Bigfoot." Others tried to explain it away. A shadow, a tree stump, maybe even a person hiking who paused to watch us. But the size doesn't make sense for a human, and the shape doesn't work for a natural feature. One friend, Ryan, who's really into wildlife photography, asked to see the other photos from that sequence. We sent him the 5 shots before and after that one. The figure only appears in that single photo. In the ones taken just moments before and after, there's nothing there but trees. Whatever this is, Ryan told us, it either moved incredibly fast or it knew exactly when to show itself and when to hide. That thought gives me chills. The idea that this thing was watching us, calculating, deciding to momentarily reveal itself, or maybe making a mistake and accidentally getting caught in the frame. We've spent hours scouring the internet, looking at other alleged Sasquatch photos, reading eyewitness accounts. Some of the descriptions match what's in our photo: the broad shoulders, the height, the dark coloring. Last week, we reached out to a professor at the University of Manitoba who specializes in wildlife biology. We didn't tell him what we thought it was, just sent the photo and asked if he could identify the figure. His response was frustratingly ambiguous. I cannot conclusively identify the figure in this image. While it has an anthropomorphic appearance, the distance and partial concealment make positive identification impossible. I would advise against jumping to extraordinary conclusions without better evidence. But that's just it. We weren't looking for extraordinary. We were just taking honeymoon photos. We didn't go to Oregon Sasquatch hunting. We accidentally captured something. The more I stare at that photo, the more I'm convinced of what I'm seeing. The proportions aren't right for a bear. The posture is too upright. It's not a human in a costume. We were miles from anywhere, on a remote stretch of road with no other cars. Who would be wandering around in a Bigfoot costume in the middle of nowhere on a random Tuesday? The location makes sense too. Oregon's forests have a long history of Sasquatch sightings. The terrain is perfect, remote, rugged, plenty of places for a large creature to remain hidden. Some people have suggested we go back and look for physical evidence, but we live in Winnipeg, over 2,000 miles away. And honestly, I'm not sure I want to go back to that exact spot. The idea that this thing was watching us, standing silently while we took photos, completely oblivious to its presence, it's unsettling. I keep thinking about what could have happened. What if we had seen it? What if one of us had wandered further into the trees? Most Sasquatch accounts describe them as shy, avoiding human contact. But still, the thought of coming face to face with something that size. Jill handles this better than I do. She's fascinated, almost excited by the possibility that we encountered something so rare. I'm more freaked out. I've had dreams about it since we discovered the photo. Dreams where I'm standing on that same rocky embankment, but when I turn around, the figure is much closer, moving toward me. We've shown the photo to about 20 people now. The reactions are split pretty evenly between definite Sasquatch and probably just a shadow or oddly shaped tree. A couple people have suggested it's fake, that we added it to the photo for attention, which is ridiculous. We're accountants from Winnipeg, not cryptid hunters or Photoshop experts. Last Sunday, Jill's brother connected us with someone he knows who works in digital forensics. He analyzed the photo and confirmed it hasn't been altered. Whatever is in that image was there when I took the picture. It's not a digital artifact or something added later. The forensics guy was careful not to claim it was a Sasquatch, but he did say, "This is a solid, three-dimensional object with mass and form. It's not a shadow or a photographic anomaly." The photo has become this weird centerpiece of conversation whenever friends come over. Everyone wants to see it, to offer their interpretation. It's like we've become the custodians of this strange mystery. I've found myself wondering if others have had similar experiences in that area. I've looked into local Sasquatch sightings near Mount Hood, and there are quite a few reports over the years. Some describe similar circumstances, hikers or campers who didn't realize they'd encountered anything until reviewing photos or footage later. One account from 2016 described a family taking pictures at a lookout point, only to discover a large, upright figure watching them from the tree line in one of their photos. Just like us, they hadn't noticed anything unusual at the time. Jill's been researching Sasquatch behavior, which feels so weird to even type. She found reports suggesting they're curious about humans but extremely stealthy. Some witnesses claim they can move through thick forest without making a sound, despite their size. That would explain why we didn't hear anything. But how did we not see it? I've replayed that 15-minute stop in my mind hundreds of times. I was focused on Jill, on getting good photos of her. I wasn't scanning the forest behind her, and Jill was looking at me or at the valley view. Neither of us had any reason to be analyzing the tree line. The photo quality is good. It was taken with my new phone, which has a great camera. But even with digital enhancement, there's a limit to how much detail we can pull out of that section of the image. We can see the figure clearly enough to know it's there, to make out its general shape and proportions, but not enough to see facial features or fine details. What strikes me most is how natural it looks in its environment. It doesn't stand out as something that doesn't belong. If you weren't specifically looking for something unusual, your eyes might just slide right past it, registering it as another tree or shadow. Perhaps that's how they've remained so elusive. Maybe our brains simply don't register them unless we're specifically looking for them. Some kind of perceptual blindness. Yesterday, I found myself looking up the exact coordinates of where we stopped that day. I've been studying the satellite view of the area, trying to understand the terrain better, to make sense of what happened. The turnout is visible on Google Maps, and so is the rocky embankment where Jill stood. Beyond that is the forest where the figure was standing. From the satellite view, I can see that there's quite a bit more forest extending behind that spot, eventually leading to even more remote wilderness, plenty of space for something to remain hidden. I don't know what we're going to do with this photo. Part of me wants to share it widely, to add it to the body of evidence that these creatures exist. Another part worries about the attention, the skepticism, the people who would accuse us of faking it. For now, we're keeping it relatively private, sharing it only with people we trust. Maybe someday we'll feel differently. What haunts me isn't just the figure in the photo, it's the knowledge that we were being watched without having any idea. It's the sudden realization that the world might contain things we thought were just myths. It's wondering how many other times in my life something might have been there, observing from just out of sight, that I never noticed. Our honeymoon was perfect. We came home with beautiful memories and hundreds of photos. We just didn't expect one of those photos to completely change how we see the world. Now, whenever we go hiking around Winnipeg, I find myself scanning the tree line, wondering what might be watching us. I'm not sure if that feeling will ever go away. Story 11. For context, I'm Trevor, 32 years old, born and raised in Edmonton. I've always been the outdoorsy type, fishing, camping, hiking, the whole 9 yards. Been doing it since I was a kid. I'm not the type to spook easily. I've had my fair share of wildlife encounters, bears, cougars, you name it. But what happened last August was something completely different, something I can't explain. My cousin Fred lives out in British Columbia, about an hour northwest of Kamloops, in this little town that's barely on the map. We've been close since we were kids, and I try to visit him every summer. His place is this rustic cabin tucked away in the woods, backing onto crown land with mountains and lakes everywhere. It's gorgeous out there, the kind of pristine wilderness that makes you forget about your day job and all the stress back home. The day it happened started out perfectly normal. It was hot, maybe 85 degrees, not a cloud in the sky. Fred suggested we head to this lake he knew about, one of those spots the locals keep to themselves. We loaded up his beat-up Tacoma with a cooler full of beer, some sandwiches, and our swimming gear. The drive took almost 45 minutes on logging roads. I remember thinking we were going awfully far for a swim, but Fred kept insisting this place was worth it. "Trust me," he said. "No tourists, no noise, just pure wilderness." He wasn't wrong about that. When we finally arrived, I was immediately impressed. The lake was stunning. crystal clear water surrounded by dense forest and rocky outcroppings. There wasn't another soul in sight. No cabins, no boats, nothing but untouched nature. The lake itself wasn't huge, maybe half a mile across, with a small pebbly beach on one side and dense forest coming right up to the water's edge everywhere else. We set up our stuff on the beach area, just threw our towels down, cracked a couple of beers, and took in the scenery. It was so quiet you could hear pine needles dropping. The only sounds were birds calling and the occasional splash of fish jumping. After a beer and some chips, we decided to cool off in the water. The water was surprisingly warm for a mountain lake. We swam out to the middle, racing each other like we used to as kids, splashing around and acting like idiots. Nothing felt off or strange. Everything was perfect. After about 20 minutes of swimming, Fred said he was getting cold and headed back to shore. I decided to stay in a bit longer, floating on my back and enjoying the sun on my face. I must have zoned out for a bit because when I looked back toward shore, I couldn't see Fred right away. Then I spotted what I thought was him standing at the edge of the trees, maybe 30 yards down from where we'd left our stuff. He was just standing there, partially obscured by the shadows of the forest. I figured he was taking a leak or something. That's when I got the idea to mess with him. Fred has always been jumpy, and I couldn't resist the opportunity to scare him. I quietly submerged myself and swam underwater toward him, planning to burst out of the water right in front of him and give him the fright of his life. I swam as long as I could underwater, only coming up for quick breaths when I needed to, keeping low in the water. As I got closer to shore, maybe 15 feet out, I could see the dark silhouette still standing there, motionless, perfect target. I got into the shallows where I could touch the bottom and prepared myself. With one big push, I lunged up out of the water, arms raised, ready to yell and scare the crap out of my cousin. But it wasn't Fred. What I came face to face with will haunt me for the rest of my life. Standing there, not 5 feet from me, was something I still struggle to describe. It was massive, towering over me at what had to be 7, maybe 8 feet tall. It was covered in thick black hair, dripping wet as if it had just been in the water too. The hair wasn't like a bear's. It was longer, straighter, almost human-like. Its shoulders were enormously broad and muscular, its arms hanging down past its knees. But it was the face that paralyzed me. It wasn't animal-like, not like a bear or anything I'd seen before. It had a flat, almost human-like face with deep-set eyes under a prominent brow ridge. Its nose was wide and flat, and I could see teeth visible in what looked like a slightly open mouth. Those eyes, Jesus, those eyes. Dark and intelligent, they locked onto mine with what I can only describe as the same shock I was feeling. There was recognition there, like it was just as surprised to see me as I was to see it. I don't know how long we stared at each other, probably only 2 or 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Water was dripping from both of us. Neither of us moved. I couldn't even breathe. My brain was short-circuiting, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then everything happened at once. It made this sound, not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, something deep and guttural that I felt in my chest. At the same moment, I let out this pathetic yelp that didn't even sound human to my own ears. And then we both bolted. I spun around and crashed back into the water, swimming harder than I've ever swum in my life. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Pure adrenaline and terror propelled me through that water like an Olympic sprinter. I remember hearing splashing behind me, branches breaking, and that same guttural sound growing more distant. I swam diagonally across the lake, as far from that spot as I could get. When I finally hit the shore on the other side, I scrambled up onto the rocks, coughing and gasping. Only then did I turn around, scanning the shoreline where I'd seen it. Nothing. Just the still forest and calm water, like nothing had happened. "Fred!" I started screaming. "Fred!" My voice echoed across the lake. No response. Panic set in again. What if that thing had found Fred? What if he was hurt? Or worse? I started running along the rocky shoreline, yelling his name, trying to make my way back to where we'd set up our stuff. After what felt like forever, I finally heard Fred yell back. Following his voice, I found him back at our little beach area, looking confused and holding a couple of fresh beers from the cooler. "Dude, what the hell? Why are you all the way over there?" he called out as I approached. "And why are you screaming like someone's trying to kill you?" I was hyperventilating, trying to catch my breath. My legs felt like jelly, and I collapsed onto my towel. Fred's expression changed from annoyance to concern when he saw the state I was in. "Trev, what happened? Are you okay?" I couldn't form coherent sentences at first, just fragments. "Something in the woods, by the water. It was huge, not a bear." Fred handed me a beer, which I immediately cracked open and chugged half of. The cold liquid helped ground me a bit, and I started to piece together what I could tell him. "I thought it was you," I began, my voice shaking. "Standing at the edge of the trees down there." I pointed to the spot, maybe 100 yards away now. "I swam up to scare you, but it wasn't you. It was, something else." Fred followed my gaze, squinting toward the tree line. "Like what, a moose? A bear?" I shook my head violently. No, it was standing, on 2 legs, the whole time. Tall, way taller than me or you, covered in black hair. But its face... I trailed off, the image still vivid in my mind. Fred was looking at me with this expression I couldn't read, somewhere between concern and skepticism. "You're serious right now? You're not messing with me?" "Do I look like I'm messing with you?" My hands were still shaking. "Fred, I swear to God, I was eye to eye with this thing. It was just as surprised to see me as I was to see it." We both freaked out and ran. Fred sat down next to me, processing. "So what you're saying is, you think you saw a Sasquatch, like Bigfoot?" Hearing him say it out loud made it sound ridiculous, but I nodded. "I don't know what else it could have been. It wasn't a bear standing up. It wasn't a guy in a suit. This thing was massive, muscular, and moved like it belonged out here." We sat in silence for a few minutes. I kept scanning the tree line, expecting to see it watching us, but there was nothing. "Let's go look," Fred finally said, standing up. "Are you insane? I'm not going back there." "Come on," he insisted, already putting his shoes on. "I'll go with you. If there's something to find, we should check it out." My instinct was to refuse, to grab our stuff and get the hell out of there. But part of me needed validation. I needed Fred to see something, anything, that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. Reluctantly, I got up and followed him. We walked along the shoreline to the spot where I'd encountered the creature. I stayed close to Fred, constantly scanning the trees, jumping at every sound. "It was right here," I said, pointing to a spot where the pebbles of the beach gave way to soil and underbrush. "It was standing right where you are now." Fred looked down, then crouched to examine the ground. After a moment, his expression changed. "Trev, come look at this." My heart racing, I moved closer. There, pressed into the soft earth at the edge of the forest, was a footprint. But not just any footprint. It was enormous, easily 16 inches long and proportionally wide. The impression was deep, like whatever made it was extremely heavy. You could make out 5 distinct toes, splayed wider than a human's would be. "Holy shit," Fred whispered, his skepticism evaporating. "There's another one over here." Sure enough, about 4 feet away was a second print, then a third leading into the trees. The stride length alone was inhuman. Fred looked up at me, his face pale. "I've hunted these woods my whole life. I've tracked every animal that lives out here. I've never seen prints like this." We followed the tracks about 20 feet into the forest before they disappeared on the rocky ground. The vegetation was disturbed, though. Broken branches, bent saplings, clear signs that something large had moved through in a hurry. "We should go," I said, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. "Now." Fred nodded. No argument this time. We hurried back to our stuff, packed it up in record time, and practically ran back to the truck. Neither of us spoke much on the drive back. What was there to say? That night, sitting on Fred's porch, we tried to rationalize what had happened. Fred revealed that there had always been stories in the area, local legends about the wild men of the mountains, indigenous tales of hair-covered giants living in the deep forests, highway workers reporting strange howls and rock-throwing incidents, hunters finding deer carcasses high up in trees where no cougar could have dragged them. I always thought it was bullshit, Fred admitted, ghost stories to scare tourists and kids. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those intelligent, surprised eyes staring into mine. I kept thinking about how it had been wet, like it had been swimming too. Had it been watching us the whole time? Had we unknowingly invaded its territory, its swimming hole? The next morning, Fred wanted to go back with a camera. I flat out refused. The thought of returning to that lake made me physically ill. We argued about it, but I wouldn't budge. Eventually, he went without me, taking his hunting buddy Mike along instead. They came back white as sheets. The footprints were still there, even clearer after some overnight rain had settled the soil. Fred had taken pictures, measured them, even made a quick plaster cast of one using some supplies from his shed. Fred and I made a pact not to tell anyone except his buddy Mike, who had seen the evidence firsthand. Who would believe us anyway? We'd be laughed out of town, written off as attention-seeking liars or drunk idiots who saw a bear and panicked. It's been almost a year now, and I haven't been back to BC. Fred keeps inviting me, saying lightning doesn't strike twice, but I can't do it. Every time I think about swimming in a lake now, I get this hollow feeling in my stomach. I keep wondering if it's out there, watching, swimming, living its life while occasionally crossing paths with humans who never see it coming. I still don't know what to make of what happened. I've spent countless hours researching, reading reports, looking at supposed evidence of Sasquatch encounters. Some of it seems like obvious hoaxes, but other accounts, they sound exactly like what happened to me. All I know is what I saw. Something that shouldn't exist according to science was standing right in front of me, close enough that I could smell its wet hair and see the water dripping from its body. I can't explain it, I can't prove it to anyone who wasn't there, but I know what I experienced. I won't be swimming in remote lakes anymore. Some mysteries in the wilderness should stay undisturbed. I think about those eyes sometimes. The intelligence behind them, the mutual shock. It was scared of me too. Maybe that's the only reason I'm still here to tell this story. Story 12. I was 24 at the time, working maintenance at one of the lodges near Harrison Hot Springs. It's beautiful country up there in British Columbia. Dense forests, mountains that seem to touch the sky, and lakes so clear you can count the pebbles 20 feet down. I'd grown up hearing the old stories, of course. Everyone in that area has. Stories about the Sasquatch, or wild men of the woods, that the local native tribes talked about. The Harrison Sasquatch sightings from the 30s were practically local legend by then, but like most young guys, I brushed them off as tall tales meant to scare tourists and children. My buddy Cal and I had 3 days off that week in late June, and we decided to do some fishing and camping in one of the more remote areas northeast of Harrison. Cal had heard from his uncle about a stream up near Spasm Glacier that was supposed to be loaded with trout. It would be a tough hike, about 30 miles through some pretty rough country, but we were young and eager for adventure. We set out early on a Tuesday morning, our packs loaded with supplies. The weather was perfect, clear blue skies, temperature in the mid-70s. The first day of hiking was uneventful, just the usual slog through forest trails and some light rock scrambling. We made good time and set up camp near a small stream about 15 miles in. That first night, I remember feeling uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The forest just seemed different somehow, quieter than it should have been. Cal didn't notice anything, or if he did, he didn't mention it. We fished for a couple hours before dark, caught a few small trout, and turned in early, planning to cover more ground the next day. I woke up around 2 in the morning to what sounded like rocks being knocked together somewhere up the slope from our camp. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I nudged Cal awake and we listened together for a few minutes. Probably just a deer or something, he whispered, but I could tell he didn't believe it. We dozed off again eventually, but I kept waking up throughout the night, always to that same tapping sound, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, as if whatever was making it was moving around our camp. The next morning, we packed up quickly and continued our trek toward the glacier. I tried to convince myself that the sounds had been nothing, maybe water dripping on rocks or branches knocking together in the breeze. But there hadn't been any breeze. Around midday, we emerged from a particularly thick section of forest into a marshy clearing that stretched for about half a mile before rising into rocky hills. The ground was soft and spongy underfoot, and we had to pick our way carefully to avoid sinking into the mud. We were about halfway across when Cal grabbed my arm so hard it left marks. "Look!" he hissed, pointing toward the tree line on the far side of the clearing. At first, I didn't see anything. Then movement caught my eye. Something big was moving along the edge of the forest. From that distance, it looked like a bear, but there was something off about how it moved. Too upright, too deliberate. "Is that a person?" I whispered. Cal just shook his head, his eyes wide. We stood frozen, watching as the figure stopped at the edge of the trees. It seemed to be looking right at us. Then, to my horror, it stood up on 2 legs. Even from 200 yards away, I could tell this was no human. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms, and it was covered in what looked like dark, reddish-brown hair. We stared at it, and it stared back at us for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds or so. Then, without warning, it let out a sound that still haunts me. A long, wailing howl that started low and rose to a pitch that made the hair on my neck stand up. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. There was something almost human in it, but twisted, wilder. "Run!" Cal said, his voice barely audible. But where? We were exposed in the middle of the marsh, and running would mean sinking into the mud with every step. The creature seemed to sense our dilemma. It took a step forward, into the clearing. That's when we heard the second howl from behind us. I turned so fast I nearly fell. There, emerging from the forest we'd just left, was another one, slightly smaller than the first, but moving with the same purposeful stride. "They're cutting us off," Cal whispered, his face white as a sheet. My mind raced. The only option was to move laterally, toward a rocky outcropping about 100 yards to our right. If we could reach it, maybe we could climb up and what? Wait them out. Hope they'd lose interest. "This way," I said, starting to move slowly toward the rocks. We tried to walk calmly, not wanting to trigger any predatory instinct by running. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder. The creatures were converging on our position, moving with surprising speed across the marshy ground. They didn't sink into the mud the way we did. They seemed to know exactly where to step. We were about 50 yards from the rocks when the first one let out another howl, and this time it broke into a run. "Go!" I shouted, and Cal and I abandoned all pretense of calm, sprinting for the rocks. The mud sucked at my boots, making each step a struggle. I could hear heavy splashing behind us. They were gaining. The rocks seemed impossibly far away. Just as we reached the base of the outcropping, I heard Cal cry out. I turned to see him stumble and go down, his foot caught in the mud. The closest creature was only about 30 yards behind him now. I ran back, grabbed his arm and hauled him to his feet. His boot came off in the mud, but there was no time to retrieve it. We scrambled up the rocks, the rough stone cutting into my hands as I pulled myself higher. We reached a flat area about 15 feet up and turned to look down. The creatures had stopped at the base of the rocks. They were even more terrifying up close. Their faces were flat, with deep-set eyes under heavy brow ridges, and their mouths were wide and filled with teeth that looked too big for their jaws. They weren't bears or gorillas or any animal I recognized, but they weren't human either. The larger one reached up, its massive hand easily spanning a crevice I had to stretch to grip, and began to climb. "Higher!" Cal shouted, and we kept going, seeking out handholds in the increasingly steep rock face. About 30 feet up, we reached a narrow ledge that ran along the face of the outcropping. It was only about 2 feet wide, but it led around to the far side of the rocks. We edged along it carefully, pressed against the rock wall, trying not to look down. We could hear the creatures below us, grunting and making those strange, rhythmic tapping sounds again. Stones against stone. They were communicating somehow. The ledge widened as we rounded the corner, revealing a small cave entrance. Without hesitation, we ducked inside. It wasn't deep, maybe 10 feet, but it was narrow and the ceiling was low. We moved to the back and crouched down, trying to control our breathing. "What the hell are those things?" Cal whispered. I shook my head. I had a pretty good idea based on the stories, but I didn't want to say it out loud, as if naming them would somehow make this nightmare more real. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 or 20 minutes. The cave entrance remained empty. Had they given up? I was starting to think maybe they couldn't climb as high as we had, or maybe they'd lost interest. Then a shadow fell across the cave entrance. One of them, the smaller one, was crouched there, its massive frame blocking most of the light. It didn't enter, just stared in at us, with eyes that reflected the daylight like a cat's. Cal had picked up a jagged rock and was holding it like a weapon, though we both knew it would be useless against something that size. I had my hunting knife, but the thought of getting close enough to use it made my stomach turn. The creature at the entrance made a low, rumbling sound. Not aggressive, exactly, more curious. It extended one massive hand into the cave, palm up, as if offering something. Then I noticed it was holding Cal's mud-covered boot. Cal and I exchanged bewildered glances. Was it returning his property? The creature placed the boot on the cave floor, just inside the entrance, then backed away slightly, still watching us. I don't know what possessed me in that moment. Maybe it was the strangely non-threatening gesture, or maybe just the adrenaline making me reckless. But I slowly moved forward. "What are you doing?" Cal hissed. I think it's trying to communicate," I whispered back. I approached the cave entrance cautiously. The creature remained crouched about 6 feet away, watching me with those reflective eyes. Up close, the smell was overwhelming, a musky animal odor mixed with something else I couldn't identify. I reached out slowly and picked up the boot, then backed away toward Cal. The creature didn't move, just continued to watch us. Then it did something that chills me to this day. It raised one hand and very deliberately tapped 3 times on the rock beside it. Tap, tap, tap. The same pattern we'd heard the night before. I was frozen in place, my mind racing. It wanted something. It was trying to tell us something. Before I could process this, there was a commotion from below, rocks sliding, heavy footsteps. The creature at our cave entrance turned its head sharply, listening. Then it looked back at us, made that rumbling sound again, and was gone, moving with surprising agility along the ledge and down the rock face. Cal and I stayed in that cave for hours, afraid to move. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the marsh. We could see no sign of the creatures, but that didn't mean they weren't out there, waiting. "We can't stay here all night," Cal said finally. "We don't have food or water, and it's going to get cold." He was right. We had left our packs in the marsh when we ran for the rocks. They contained not just our food and water, but our sleeping bags, extra clothes, everything we needed to survive out here. "Maybe they're gone," I said, not believing it for a second. we decided to wait until full dark before making a move. Our reasoning was that if these creatures were like most animals, they probably had better night vision than we did, but at least the darkness would conceal us from a distance. It was a terrible plan, born of desperation, but it was all we had. As the last light faded, we carefully made our way out of the cave and along the ledge. The descent down the rocks was nerve-wracking, trying to find handholds in the dark, every small sound making us freeze in terror. When we finally reached the marsh, we paused to get our bearings. The moon was bright enough to see by, and we could just make out the dark shapes of our packs where we had dropped them. We moved as quietly as we could, which wasn't very quiet given the sucking mud. Every step sounded thunderous to my ears. We had just reached our packs when we heard it. The tapping sound coming from the tree line. Tap, tap, tap. "Run!" Cal whispered, grabbing his pack. I slung mine over my shoulder, and we took off toward the trees in the opposite direction from the sound. The mud made running nearly impossible, so it was more of a desperate slog, expecting at any moment to feel massive hands grabbing us from behind. We reached the tree line and plunged into the forest, not caring about the trail anymore, just wanting to put as much distance as possible between us and those creatures. We ran through the night, stumbling over roots, getting whipped by branches, totally lost, but too terrified to stop. Whenever we paused to catch our breath, we would hear it, that tapping sound, sometimes from behind us, sometimes from beside us. It was as if they were herding us. I realized at some point that we were heading downhill, which meant we were moving away from the glacier and back toward Harrison. That was fine by me. The fishing trip was definitely over. Dawn found us exhausted, scratched and mud-covered, but still moving. The tapping had stopped sometime during the night, or maybe we had just outrun it. We found a small stream and collapsed beside it, gulping water and checking our supplies. Amazingly, we still had most of our food, though Cal's sleeping bag had been torn open when we ran, scattering down everywhere. "What were those things?" Cal asked between breaths. I hesitated, then said it. "Sasquatch. Had to be, like in the Harrison stories." Cal nodded slowly. "I always thought those were just stories," he said. "Me too." We rested for an hour, then tried to figure out where we were. Without the trail, it was hard to say, but based on the sun and the terrain, we thought we were heading in roughly the right direction. We still had at least 20 miles to go before we reached any kind of civilization. We traveled all day, moving as fast as our exhausted bodies would allow. The forest seemed normal now. Birds were singing, small animals rustled in the underbrush. There was no sign of anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Late in the afternoon, we found ourselves at the edge of a ravine. At the bottom, maybe 50 feet down, was a fast-moving creek. On the other side, the land rose steeply again. "We'll have to find a way around," I said, looking up and down the ravine. That's when we saw it, a massive log spanning the creek like a bridge. It was an old-growth cedar, at least 5 feet in diameter, that had fallen across the ravine. It looked stable enough, but using it would mean walking along the top of it for about 30 feet, with nothing to hold on to and a 50-foot drop to the rocks below. "I don't like it," Cal said, voicing my own thoughts. We were debating whether to try the log or look for another crossing when we heard it again, tap, 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 from the forest behind us. We looked at each other, the decision made in an instant. The log bridge it was. I went first, my arms out for balance, taking slow, careful steps. The log was wide enough that footing wasn't an issue, but the height made my head swim if I looked down. I fixed my eyes on the far side and kept moving. I was about halfway across when I heard Cal shout. I turned, nearly losing my balance, to see him pointing back toward the forest. They were there, standing at the edge of the clearing, both of them, watching us. "Keep going!" Cal shouted, stepping onto the log himself. I turned and continued, moving faster now despite the danger. Behind me, I could hear Cal's footsteps on the log, quick and uneven. I reached the other side and turned to help Cal, who was about 10 feet behind me. That's when I saw the larger creature step onto the log. It moved with incredible confidence, its long arms held slightly out for balance, but otherwise erect and steady. The log barely seemed to bend under its weight. Cal saw it too and panicked. He tried to move faster, his foot slipped, and for one heart-stopping moment he teetered on the edge of the log. I lunged forward, grabbing his outstretched hand just as he started to fall. For a second, his full weight hung from my grip, and I thought we were both going over. Then he managed to get his other hand on the log and pull himself up. We scrambled up the bank on the far side of the ravine, then turned to look back. The creature had stopped in the middle of the log. The second one was now at the edge, watching. The one on the log looked at us for a long moment, then deliberately raised its hand and tapped 3 times on the log. Tap, tap, tap. Then it turned around and walked calmly back to join its companion. They stood there for a moment longer, watching us, before turning and disappearing into the forest. Cal and I didn't wait to see if they would find another way across. We ran, pushing our exhausted bodies as hard as we could, desperate to put distance between us and that ravine. We finally stumbled into a ranger station late that night, nearly delirious with exhaustion. We told them we had gotten lost, which was true enough. We didn't mention the creatures. Who would have believed us? Cal and I never spoke about what happened, not really. He moved away a few months later, took a job in Seattle. I stayed at Harrison for another year before also moving on. I've spent years trying to make sense of it. Those creatures could have killed us easily, so why didn't they? That moment with the boot still haunts me. It was almost like they were studying us, as curious about us as we were terrified of them. Sometimes I think about that tapping sound. Was it communication? Were they talking to each other, trying to talk to us? I've read about the other sightings in the area over the years, the Harrison Sasquatch tales from the 30s, the reports from prospectors near Spasm Glacier, the giant footprints found in that potato field. It all fits with what we saw. I've never gone back to those woods, but sometimes, when I'm camping or hiking in other remote areas, I find myself listening, straining to hear that familiar sound in the darkness. Tap, tap, tap. I know they're out there, and sometimes I think they remember me too. Story 13. I've never shared this outside my immediate family until now. It's been 14 years since it happened, and I still get uneasy when I think about it. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm not even sure I'd believe it if someone told me this story, but I need to get it off my chest. Back in 2009, I was a 16-year-old kid living in northern British Columbia, near a tiny place called Riss Creek. That's not its real name, but it's close enough. Growing up there, you either learn to love the outdoors or you go crazy from boredom. There wasn't much to do except hunt, fish, and ride. I was pretty good at rodeo riding. Nothing professional, but I could stay on a bull longer than most kids my age. That November, I got invited on what was supposed to be an awesome hunting trip. 3 older guys I knew through the rodeo circuit. Jim Palmentier, 22, Earl Condon, 20, and Kid Chatland, 19, were planning a winter expedition into the wilderness northeast of Riss Creek. They needed a 4th person, and I guess I was the least annoying option among the younger guys. My parents were hesitant at first. I mean, I was only 16, and this was serious backcountry stuff. No roads, no cell service, nothing but wilderness for miles. But they knew the other guys, especially Jim, who had a good head on his shoulders and plenty of outdoor experience. Eventually they agreed, probably figuring it would make a man out of me, or whatever parents think when they let their kids do potentially dangerous stuff. We set out on November 14th. The plan was to travel by canoe. We had 2 20-foot freighter canoes loaded with gear, and follow a chain of lakes and rivers deep into hunting territory. Jim and I shared one canoe, while Kid and Earl took the other. We packed enough supplies for 10 days, including rifles, ammunition, camping gear, and food. The goal was to get a moose or two, and maybe some smaller game before winter really set in. The first 2 days were uneventful. Hard work, sure, portaging those heavy canoes between water bodies is no joke. But nothing unusual happened. We saw plenty of wildlife, caught some fish, and generally had a good time. The weather was holding, cold but clear, with temperatures dropping into the 20s at night, but warming up enough during the day to keep the smaller waterways from freezing. Everything changed on the third day. We'd spotted a young bull moose early that morning and managed to take it down with a clean shot. We spent most of the day field dressing it and preparing the meat. It was a good kill, not huge, but big enough to provide several 100 pounds of meat. While we were working, a group of First Nations people passed by in their own canoes. They were from a community further north and were heading home after some business in one of the southern settlements. Jim, always respectful of local customs, offered them some of the fresh meat. They accepted gratefully and stayed to chat for a bit. I remember one of the older men looking around nervously, saying something in their language to the others. When we asked if something was wrong, he just shook his head and said we should be careful in these parts, especially as winter approached. At the time, I thought he was just warning us about the weather. Before they left, they helped us build a meat cache. We constructed a platform about 12 feet off the ground, suspended between 4 trees. This would keep the meat safe from bears and other scavengers while we continued hunting. We hung most of the moose meat there, keeping just enough for dinner that night. We made camp about 2 miles downriver from the cache, on a flat stretch of bank beside a narrow but deep stream, probably 40 or 50 feet across. It was a perfect spot, level ground for the tents, close to water and sheltered from the wind by a ridge behind us. On the other side of the stream was dense forest, dark pines stretching up a gradual slope. We set up 2 tents, again Jim and I in one, Kid and Earl in the other. We built a fire, cooked some of the moose meat, and sat around swapping stories until about 10 o'clock. The temperature was dropping fast, so we decided to turn in. Jim and I were exhausted from the day's work and fell asleep almost immediately. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up, late, maybe 1 or 2 in the morning. What I do remember is the sound that woke me. A massive crash, followed by yelling. I shot up, heart pounding. Jim was already scrambling for the tent opening. Outside, Kid was shouting something incoherent. We tumbled out of the tent to find complete chaos. Our cooking area was destroyed. A boulder, and I mean a serious massive rock at least the size of a microwave, had smashed through our cooking equipment, flattening our portable stove and scattering pots everywhere. At first, I thought it must have fallen from the ridge behind us, but that didn't make sense. The ridge was a good 30 yards back from our camp. Earl was helping Kid to his feet. Kid looked dazed, with a cut on his forehead that was bleeding pretty badly. "What the hell happened?" Jim asked, grabbing a flashlight. "Something hit our tent," Earl said, his voice shaking. "A fucking rock or something nearly hit Kid in the head." Sure enough, their tent was partially collapsed with another boulder, this one bigger than the first, sitting half inside it. Kid had been lucky. If he'd been sleeping just a foot to the left, he would have been crushed. We were all freaking out, trying to figure out what was happening, when another rock slammed into the ground about 10 feet from where we were standing. The impact was so powerful, it buried itself halfway into the frozen soil. "Take cover!" Jim yelled, pulling me behind a fallen tree. That's when we heard it. A strange, eerie hooting sound coming from across the stream. It wasn't an owl or any animal I recognized. It was almost deliberate, like someone trying to mimic an animal, but not quite getting it right. We all froze, straining to see across the water. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to make out shapes, but not details. Something was moving through the trees on the other side. Something big. "Bear," Kid whispered hopefully, but we all knew better. Bears don't throw rocks. Another boulder came crashing through the trees, splashing into the middle of the stream. Then another one flew over our heads, missing Jim by inches and smashing into our canoe, putting a serious dent in the side. "Is someone throwing those?" Earl asked, his voice barely audible. That's when it hit me. Whatever was throwing these rocks was on the opposite bank, at least 50 feet away. And these weren't small rocks. Some of them had to weigh 150, maybe 200 pounds. No human could throw something that heavy that far. It wasn't possible. The hooting sound came again, louder this time, followed by what I can only describe as a roar, deep, guttural, and absolutely terrifying. It wasn't a bear or a cougar. I'd heard both before, and this was something entirely different. It echoed through the trees, making the hair on my neck stand straight up. We huddled behind the fallen tree, too terrified to move, as more rocks continued to rain down on our camp. Some splashed into the stream, others crashed through the trees around us. The barrage went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 or 20 minutes. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The forest went completely silent. No hooting, no movement, nothing. We waited, barely breathing, for what seemed like forever. "We need to get the hell out of here," Jim finally whispered. "As soon as it's light enough to see." No one argued. We spent the rest of that horrible night huddled together, taking turns keeping watch. None of us slept. Every sound from the forest made us jump. I've never been so terrified in my life, before or since. As the first grey light of dawn appeared, we quickly gathered what gear hadn't been destroyed. Half our cooking equipment was smashed beyond repair. One of the tents was ruined. Kid's sleeping bag had been shredded by the rock that nearly killed him. But at least the canoes were still usable, despite the dent in ours. We wanted to leave immediately, but Jim insisted we check the meat cache first. If whatever had attacked us during the night was still in the area, we didn't want to leave all that meat for it. Besides, we'd need food for the journey back. We approached the cache site cautiously, rifles ready. What we found there stopped us in our tracks. The entire structure was gone, not just the meat, the entire platform. The ropes had been ripped from the trees, splintering branches that were 8 inches thick. The 4 main support poles had been snapped like twigs. Everything was gone. "What the hell could do this?" Kid whispered, voicing what we were all thinking. There were tracks around the area, huge barefoot-looking prints that disappeared into the underbrush. They were roughly human-shaped but massive, easily twice the size of my boot. The ground was too frozen to hold clear impressions. But what we could see was frightening enough. We didn't waste any more time. We got back to our canoes and paddled like our lives depended on it, which I'm pretty sure they did. We didn't stop until we reached the middle of a large lake several miles away. We spent that night in the canoes, tied together in the middle of the lake, taking turns keeping watch while the others tried to sleep. It took us 2 more days of hard travel to get back to civilization. We didn't stop to hunt again. We barely stopped to eat. Kid's head wound got infected, and he was running a fever by the time we made it back. The local clinic patched him up, but he needed antibiotics for weeks afterward. When we told people what happened, most thought we were either lying or had misinterpreted something normal, like a landslide. A few of the older First Nations people nodded knowingly, but wouldn't say much except to confirm that there were things in those woods that people shouldn't disturb. It's been 14 years since that night, and I'm still not sure what happened. What I'm sure of is that those rocks were thrown, not rolled or dislodged, but physically hurled across that stream with incredible force. I'm sure that whatever made those sounds wasn't human or any known animal, and I'm absolutely certain that no bear, no matter how strong, could have completely dismantled that meat cache the way it was. I never went back to that part of British Columbia again. Neither did any of the others. Jim moved to Alberta the following year. Kid and Earl both joined the military, I think partly to convince themselves they weren't cowards for being so terrified that night. As for me, I still live in BC, but much closer to Vancouver now. I still hunt sometimes, but never alone, and never in remote areas. I don't talk about what happened very often. Most people don't believe it anyway, but sometimes when I'm lying awake at night and the wind is moving through the trees outside my window, I hear that hooting sound again in my memory. And I wonder what exactly was hunting us that night in the wilderness, and if it's still out there, waiting. Story 14. I've never shared this before. I'm not the kind of person who believes in monsters or the paranormal, or at least I wasn't. What happened that night changed everything for me. I still get goosebumps thinking about it, and sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, hearing those heavy footsteps circling my house. For context, I moved to rural Florida about 3 years ago. I needed to get away from city life after a messy breakup and some career setbacks. I found this little rental house surrounded by orange groves, swampland and woods. It was perfect, affordable, peaceful, and far enough from everyone that I could clear my head. My closest neighbors were an elderly couple, Marvin and Edith Wilson, who lived across the dirt road on a small farm where they grew vegetables and kept a few chickens. Marvin and Edith were the sweetest people. They sort of adopted me from day one. Edith would bring over homemade bread, and Marvin would invite me for coffee on their porch most mornings. It became our little ritual. Coffee at 7 a.m., talking about nothing and everything. Marvin would tell stories about the area, the wildlife, the weather patterns. I think they were just happy to have someone to talk to. About 6 months after I moved in, I got myself a puppy, a German Shepherd mix I named Rex. He was my little buddy, always following me around the property. Life was simple and peaceful. I was working remotely as a web designer, spending my evenings on my porch, watching the sunset with Rex and a beer. It felt like I'd found my place. Then one morning last summer, I headed over to Marvin and Edith's place for our usual coffee. Marvin seemed different, agitated, looking tired with dark circles under his eyes. When I asked if everything was okay, he glanced at Edith, who just shook her head slightly. "Something's been getting into my garden," he finally said, sipping his coffee with shaky hands. "Been happening for weeks now." I suggested raccoons, or maybe wild hogs, which are common in the area, but Marvin shook his head firmly. "No, Jake, it's bigger, much bigger." He set his cup down hard. "It's a Bigfoot." I nearly choked on my coffee. I thought he was joking at first, but his expression was dead serious. "A Bigfoot? Come on, Marvin. I've seen the footprints," he insisted. "Biggest damn prints I've ever seen. And it only comes at night. Takes my vegetables, the corn especially, breaks the stalks right in half." I nodded politely, not wanting to offend him. Edith just sighed like she'd heard this before. I figured Marvin was just getting a bit senile. He was in his late 70s after all. I changed the subject and we moved on to talking about the weather forecast. On my walk home, I chuckled to myself. Bigfoot in Florida. Sure, there were stories about the skunk ape in the Everglades, but we weren't anywhere near there. Plus, I'd been living here for months without seeing anything stranger than a particularly large possum. For the next few weeks, Marvin would update me on his Bigfoot situation every morning, how it had taken more vegetables, how he'd found strange hair caught on his fence, how he'd heard wood-knocking sounds from the forest at night. I just nodded and played along, not wanting to upset him. Edith would roll her eyes behind his back, which made me feel better about not taking it seriously. Then came that night in July. It was hot, even for Florida in summer. The air was thick with humidity, making it hard to breathe. I'd finished work around 9 p.m. and decided to sit on my porch with Rex, who was about 7 months old by then. The mosquitoes weren't too bad that evening, which was a small miracle. I had a cold beer and was just scrolling through my phone with Rex playing with his rope toy at my feet. Around 10:30, Rex suddenly stopped playing. His ears perked up, and he stared intently at the tree line about 50 yards from my porch. I didn't think much of it at first. probably a raccoon or possum. But then he started growling, a deep, serious growl I'd never heard from him before. "What's up, buddy?" I asked, sitting up straight and peering into the darkness. That's when I heard it, heavy footsteps and the sound of branches snapping, not like a deer or even a wild hog. These were heavy, deliberate steps. Something big was moving through the brush. Rex's growl turned into frantic barking. I stood up, trying to see through the darkness. The motion sensor light on the side of my house hadn't triggered yet, which meant whatever it was hadn't come close enough. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. "Is someone there?" No response, just more footsteps and rustling. Rex was going absolutely crazy now, but I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. He was backing up toward the door. Rex wasn't a coward. He'd chase after anything, but now he was retreating, still barking but clearly terrified. I'm not ashamed to admit that fear gripped me then. My hands started shaking as I reached down to grab Rex by the collar. What the hell was out there? The footsteps got louder, closer. I remembered my rifle inside, a .30-06 I kept mainly for wild hogs that sometimes got aggressive. I hurried inside, locked the door behind me, and grabbed the gun from my closet. Rex was whimpering now, pacing nervously by the front window. I loaded the rifle with trembling hands and tried to control my breathing. Maybe it was just someone trespassing. But why would they be sneaking around in the woods at night? That's when the footsteps changed direction. Whatever it was began circling toward the back of my house. Slow, heavy steps, deliberate, like it knew exactly where it was going. I moved to the back of the house, keeping away from the windows. Rex followed, still whimpering. The back door was just a simple thing with a deadbolt and a small window at eye level. I stood to the side, rifle ready, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside my back door. For a moment there was complete silence. Even the usual chorus of frogs and crickets had gone quiet. Then I heard breathing. Heavy, raspy breathing, like something with massive lungs taking deep breaths. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I was frozen in place, afraid to move, afraid to make a sound. Then the door handle rattled, not gently like someone testing if it was open. It shook violently, like something strong was trying to force it. The entire door frame creaked under the pressure. I raised my rifle, pointing it at the door, finger hovering near the trigger. The rattling stopped. There was that breathing again, then a long, low sound, not quite a growl, not quite a moan. It made the hair on my arms stand up. Then something hit the door, hard, like a body slamming against it. The door shuddered in its frame. Another slam, and I saw the wood around the hinges starting to splinter. Whatever was out there was trying to break in. Panic took over. I couldn't stay in the house. If that thing got in, I'd be trapped. I grabbed Rex's collar, ran to the front door, unlocked it as quietly as I could, and burst outside. I sprinted across my yard toward the orange grove, hoping to circle around to the road. Rex was right beside me, running for his life too. I could hear it behind us, the heavy footsteps now moving fast, crashing through the underbrush. I didn't look back, just kept running between the rows of orange trees. The ground was uneven, and in my panic I caught my foot on an exposed root. I went down hard, tumbling into a muddy patch at the edge of the swamp. My rifle flew from my hands, landing somewhere in the muck. I scrambled to my hands and knees, desperately searching for the gun in the dark. Rex was barking frantically, facing back the way we'd come. That's when I finally looked up. Standing at the edge of the orange grove, partially illuminated by the moonlight, was something I still struggled to describe. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, its arms hanging down almost to its knees. It was covered in dark, shaggy hair, not fur exactly, but long hair that moved slightly in the night breeze. But it was the eyes that still haunt me. They caught the moonlight, reflecting it slightly like a cat's eyes, but bigger, so much bigger. And they were fixed directly on me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was like my body had completely shut down. The thing, I can't bring myself to call it Bigfoot even now, just stood there, watching me. not approaching, not retreating, just watching with those terrible eyes. Rex's barking had turned to whimpering again. He pressed against my leg, trembling. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me frozen in the mud, the creature watching from the tree line. It felt like hours, but was probably just minutes. Then, thank God, I saw headlights on the road. Someone was driving by. I broke from my trance and ran toward the road, waving my arms frantically. Rex bolted ahead of me. The pickup truck slowed, and I recognized Mike, a guy who worked at the local feed store. I must have looked insane, covered in mud, wild-eyed, without my rifle. "Jake, what the hell, man?" he asked as I practically threw myself at his truck. "Drive," I gasped. "Please, just drive." He must have seen the genuine terror in my face because he didn't ask questions, just let me and Rex climb in and drove us to the nearest gas station about 5 miles away. I told Mike everything while we sat in his truck in the gas station parking lot. He didn't laugh like I expected. Instead, he nodded slowly. "You're not the first person to see something like that around here," he said quietly. "Most folks just don't talk about it." We went back to my place an hour later, bringing 2 of Mike's buddies with us. I was still shaking as we approached my house. The back door was hanging off its hinges, with deep scratch marks along the frame. My rifle was exactly where I'd dropped it, half buried in mud. But there was no sign of the creature. The next morning, after a sleepless night at Mike's place, I went to see Marvin. I needed to talk to him, to apologize for not believing him. He was in his garden, inspecting damaged corn stalks when I approached. I told him everything. When I finished, he just looked at me with those weathered eyes. "I told you so," he said simply. "Been trying to tell folks for years. Nobody listens to an old man." He showed me the footprints in his garden, massive impressions in the soil, easily twice the size of my foot. They matched exactly what Mike and his buddies had found around my house the night before. "What is it?" I asked Marvin. He shrugged. "Don't rightly know. Been here longer than us, that's all I know. Usually keeps to itself unless food gets scarce." I moved out of that house within a week, found a place closer to town. I still see Marvin and Edith regularly, still have coffee with them, but I never sit out on my porch at night anymore. Never. And when I drive home after dark, I don't slow down or stop for anything. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I wouldn't have believed it myself if someone had told me. But I know what I saw that night. I know what tried to break into my home. And I know that there are things in this world that we can't explain. Things that exist, whether we choose to believe in them or not. I still have nightmares about those eyes. Sometimes I wake up thinking I can hear heavy footsteps circling my new house. But I never look out the window to check. Some things once seen can't be unseen, and some fears never really go away. Story 15. I've never really shared this story with many people. My own family didn't believe me when I first mentioned it years ago, so I just stopped bringing it up. But after finding this forum, I think maybe someone here will understand what I experienced. It's been almost 27 years now, but I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was the summer of 1996. My husband Tom, our son Michael, who was 11 at the time, and I decided to take a camping trip to Wekiwa Springs State Park, just outside Orlando. We'd been there a few times before. It's a beautiful place with these crystal clear springs, lots of wildlife, and peaceful hiking trails. We loved getting away from the noise of the city, and Michael always had such a great time exploring. We arrived on a Friday afternoon in July. The Florida heat was brutal that day, probably in the high 90s, with that awful humidity that makes you feel like you're walking through soup. But we were excited anyway. We had this pop-up camper trailer that Tom had found at a garage sale the year before. Nothing fancy, but it was comfortable enough and kept us off the ground. We set up at our usual spot, somewhat isolated from the other campsites, backing up to a dense section of forest. I remember Tom struggling with the camper because one of the support poles was bent, and he kept cursing under his breath while Michael and I unpacked the coolers. By evening, we had everything set up. The camper expanded with the beds pulled out, our little folding table and chairs arranged outside, and a small fire going in the pit. That night was perfectly normal. We roasted hot dogs, made s'mores, and Tom told ghost stories that weren't actually scary, but made Michael giggle anyway. The campground was nearly full, but everyone was respectful and quiet. I remember falling asleep to the sound of crickets and distant frogs, feeling totally at peace. The next morning is when everything changed. We had breakfast and planned to go hiking and swimming in the springs. Michael was in such a hurry to get going that he wasn't paying attention. He was running around our campsite, collecting sticks for who knows what, when he tripped over the corner of the fire pit. He didn't fall into the fire. Thank God we hadn't lit it yet that morning. But he caught his arm on the metal rim and sliced it open pretty badly. There was so much blood. Tom immediately grabbed our first aid kit, but it was obvious that Michael needed stitches. The cut was deep and long, running from his wrist halfway up his forearm. Michael was crying, not sobbing, but that quiet, shocked kind of crying kids do when they're really hurt. Tom wrapped the wound as best he could with gauze and a bandage. "Margaret, I'm going to take him to the emergency room," Tom said, already gathering his keys and wallet. "Do you want to come or stay here with our stuff?" I looked around at our campsite. We had quite a bit of gear out, and I knew from past experience that the local emergency room was always packed on weekends. Someone needed to stay with the camp. "I'll stay," I told him. "Just call me from the hospital when you know something." Tom nodded, helped Michael into the car, and they left. I stood there waving as they drove away, feeling that strange mix of worry for my son and relief that Tom was handling it. It was around 9 in the morning. The campground got quiet after that. It was a Saturday, so most people had headed out to the springs or the hiking trails. A few sites still had people lounging around, but they were far enough away that I couldn't hear their conversations. I decided to straighten up the campsite and then maybe read my book. It was getting hotter by the minute, so I opened up the camper to air it out a bit. The pop-up camper had canvas sides with zippered flaps that acted as windows. I unzipped the main one near the door, about halfway, to let some air circulate. This window flap was pretty high up. When the camper was fully expanded, the opening was about 7 feet off the ground. After tidying up, I climbed into the camper to lie down. I was tired from being up late the night before, and the heat was making me drowsy. I remember checking my watch. It was around 11:30. I figured Tom would be calling from the hospital soon, so I didn't want to fall asleep. But I did close my eyes for a bit. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember is being startled awake by something. At first I wasn't sure what had woken me. The campground was eerily quiet. No people chatting, no car engines, not even any birds singing. Just this heavy, thick silence that felt wrong somehow. Then I heard it. Breathing. Deep, powerful breathing. Right outside the camper, directly next to the partially open window flap. At first, I thought maybe someone from another campsite had walked up to check if anyone was home. But as I became fully awake, I realized this wasn't normal human breathing. It was too forceful, too rhythmic. In and out, with this rumbling quality that I could almost feel vibrating through the camper wall. I lay there frozen, afraid to move. The breathing continued, steady and powerful. Whatever was making that sound was big, really big, and it was standing right outside my camper, breathing through the opening about 7 feet off the ground. I tried to think logically. A bear? No, bears don't stand that tall, and they don't just stand silently breathing outside campers. A person playing a prank. But who could reach that high without standing on something, and why would they just breathe without saying anything? The breathing continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only about 30 seconds. Each breath sounded deliberate, like it was smelling the air inside our camper. I remember thinking very clearly, whatever is making that sound is massive, and it's right on the other side of this thin canvas wall. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it could hear it. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but lie there listening to those heavy breaths. The flap was open just enough that if something wanted to, it could reach a hand or a paw inside. Then there was a shift in the sound, a slight change in position. I could tell it had moved slightly closer to the opening. The breathing became more distinct, more focused. And that's when my survival instinct finally kicked in. "Get out of here!" I screamed as loud as I could, my voice cracking with fear. There was a moment of complete silence after my scream. The breathing stopped. For a split second, I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Then I heard it. A single, heavy footstep moving away from the camper, followed by the sound of something large moving through the underbrush at the edge of our sight. Not running, not crashing through, but moving deliberately, quietly for its size. Just a few soft crackles of twigs, the subtle shifting of branches, and then nothing. I was still frozen in place, my whole body trembling, when I heard a car pull up. Doors slammed and I heard Tom calling my name. By some crazy coincidence, they had returned at that exact moment. I tried to call out, but my voice wouldn't work. I finally managed to climb out of the camper just as Tom approached with Michael, his arm now properly bandaged and in a sling. The hospital had been unusually empty, so they'd been seen right away. 13 stitches and a tetanus shot. "Margaret, what's wrong?" Tom asked, seeing my face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to tell him what had happened, but at that moment, a park ranger pulled up behind our car. He'd seen Tom drive in and wanted to check if everything was okay. He noticed Michael's bandaged arm and then looked at me. "Mom, are you all right? You look unwell," he said. I wasn't all right. The shock of whatever had just happened, combined with seeing my son's injury properly bandaged up, it was too much. My vision started tunneling, my knees buckled, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up on one of our camping chairs with Tom fanning me and the ranger offering me water. In the commotion of my fainting, checking on Michael's injury, and the ranger insisting on calling the camp medic to check me over, I never got to tell anyone what had happened. By the time everything calmed down, it seemed too strange, too unbelievable to mention. We ended up cutting our trip short and heading home that evening. For years, I convinced myself it must have been something explainable. Maybe a tall camper had walked by. Maybe the wind had created that breathing sound. Maybe I'd been half asleep and dreamed it. I almost managed to forget about it entirely, until about 5 years ago. I was at my daughter's house, watching a documentary with my grandson Jason. He's always been interested in cryptids and unexplained phenomena, Loch Ness Monster, UFOs, that kind of thing. The documentary was about Bigfoot sightings across America, and they were interviewing witnesses in Florida. One woman described hearing powerful breathing outside her tent while camping in the Ocala National Forest, not far from Wekiwa Springs. As she spoke, describing the deep, rhythmic sound, the hair on my arms stood up. It was exactly what I had experienced. That's when it all came rushing back. The breathing, the height of the camper window, the way whatever it was had moved so quietly away despite its obvious size. I sat there stunned while Jason kept watching, oblivious to my reaction. When the show ended, I told Jason about my experience. He was fascinated and pulled out his laptop right there, showing me reports of similar encounters in Central Florida. There were dozens of them, strange breathing sounds, glimpses of large figures in the forests, unusual footprints. Many reports mentioned how something so large could move with surprising stealth. "Grandma, I think you had a Sasquatch encounter," Jason said, completely serious. At first I laughed it off. Bigfoot in Central Florida? It seemed ridiculous. But the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. Whatever was outside my camper that day was tall enough to breathe through an opening 7 feet off the ground. It was massive enough that I could hear and almost feel its breathing. And despite its size, it moved away almost silently. I started doing my own research after that. I learned that Florida actually has a long history of Bigfoot-type sightings, often called the skunk ape, because of the odor witnesses sometimes report. I didn't smell anything that day, but everything else fits. The thing that still haunts me is what might have happened if I hadn't screamed, or if Tom and Michael hadn't returned at that exact moment. Was it just curious? Was it aggressive? I'll never know. I've gone back and forth about whether to share this story. Most people would think I'm either lying or was confused about what happened. But I know what I experienced. I was fully awake. It was broad daylight. And something massive, something that breathed with power and purpose, was standing outside our camper that day. What bothers me most is that I was completely unaware of the danger I might have been in. If it hadn't made those breathing sounds, I would never have known it was there. How silently must it have approached? How long had it been standing there before I noticed? These questions still keep me up at night sometimes. I've never gone camping again. Tom tried to convince me a few times over the years, but I always found excuses. He passed away 3 years ago, never knowing why I suddenly developed this aversion to camping. I wish now that I'd told him, even if he didn't believe me. Jason has encouraged me to report my experience to research groups, but I've been hesitant. After 27 years, what's the point? But finding this forum has made me think that maybe sharing my story might help someone else who's had a similar experience and felt too afraid or embarrassed to talk about it. I still live in Florida, though much closer to the coast now, and far from any state parks. Sometimes when I'm driving past densely wooded areas, I find myself scanning the tree line, wondering. And on quiet nights, when the air is still, I sometimes wake up thinking I hear that same deep, powerful breathing outside my window. I know now what was outside my camper that day at Wekiwa Springs. Something wild, something ancient, something that isn't supposed to exist. A Sasquatch. And no matter how many years pass, I can still hear those breaths, feel that presence, and remember the absolute certainty that whatever was standing outside was not human.